Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Ethan Clark's apartment was a cramped, cluttered mess. The flickering light from a cheap desk lamp barely illuminated the chaos of sheet music, old vinyl records, and piles of discarded coffee cups. The faint hum of the city outside drifted through the thin windows, but inside, it was silent, save for the sound of his fingers dancing across the piano keys. He had been playing for hours, his hands moving mechanically over the familiar chords, but his mind wasn't in the music. It hadn't been for weeks. He'd come to a standstill, creatively drained, like a painter who had forgotten how to hold a brush. No new melodies, no fresh ideas, just the same tired notes, played over and over in search of inspiration that refused to come. Ethan paused, resting his hands on the worn ivory keys, staring down at the empty sheet music in front of him. He had been hoping for a spark, something, anything that would bring him back to life as a musician. But so far, the silence had only deepened. Maybe I'm just washed up, he muttered to himself. Maybe this is all I've got. The sound of a distant church bell tolled, signaling midnight. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been one of those nights, long, filled with frustration and no closer to resolution. He pushed his chair back and wandered to the corner of his apartment, where a small stack of records lay, half forgotten. He flipped through the albums, his fingers brushing over the familiar covers, each one a relic of his past, some with yellowed corners, others with cracked spines. One album in particular caught his attention, an old, unmarked record with a faded label. Unknown composer, it read in jagged handwriting. Ethan frowned. He didn't remember buying it. He couldn't even recall where it had come from. But something about the cover intrigued him, its simplicity, its mystery. Without thinking, he slid the record out of its sleeve, placed it on the turntable, and lowered the needle. The first crackling notes filled the room. The melody was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard. Soft, almost haunting, like the sound of a lullaby played through a thin veil of fog. It was a song full of sorrow, but also strange beauty, its rhythm both familiar and unsettling. He stood motionless, the sound washing over him. There was something so intimate about it, something that pulled him in deeper with each note. He felt the familiar spark of inspiration flicker in the pit of his stomach. It was almost as though the song was speaking to him, as though it knew exactly what he was feeling, lost, stuck, yearning for something more. Ethan didn't notice the passage of time as he stood there, listening. The melody seemed to stretch on endlessly, bending and warping in ways he couldn't quite understand. His fingers itched to transcribe the notes, to capture it in the form of sheet music. He needed to learn it, needed to play it. He turned the volume up, the sound filling the small apartment. The music swelled and grew, becoming more complex, its haunting undertones carrying something darker than what he had first perceived. It was as though it was coaxing him into a trance. Suddenly, there was a faint, echoing sound, almost like a whisper, floating just beneath the music. It was too soft to make out, but it seemed to be coming from the record itself. Ethan blinked, feeling a chill crawl down his spine. He glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching him. But he was alone. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but it still eluded him, slipping away whenever he tried to focus. His heart raced, but he couldn't stop listening. The song called to him, and he couldn't look away. Thud! Ethan jerked his head toward the door. Was that? The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the hallway outside. He stood frozen, his eyes wide. No one had been there when he came in. The building was mostly empty at this hour, with only a few tenants on its floor. Yet there it was again, slow, deliberate footsteps. Ethan swallowed, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He glanced back at the record player, the haunting melody still drifting through the room. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse. Silence. Only the music. The footsteps had stopped. But then, another sound, a light tapping on the apartment door. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan moved cautiously to the door, his pulse quickening. He grabbed the doorknob and pulled it open, expecting to find some random neighbor or a late-night delivery. But the hallway was empty. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows, but there was no one in sight. "Great," he muttered, stepping back into his apartment. "Just what I need. More weirdness." He shut the door and locked it, leaning against it for a moment to catch his breath. The tapping had stopped, but something was still off, a lingering feeling in the air that he couldn't shake. It was as though something had just passed through, something he couldn't quite understand. The music was still playing, but now it seemed different, darker. There was an intensity to it, a presence in the room that hadn't been there before. Ethan rubbed his eyes and went back to the turntable, stopping the record. The needle scraped across the vinyl with a harsh, grinding sound. "That's enough," he whispered to himself. But as soon as the music stopped, the room grew unnervingly silent. It felt like a void, and then, almost as if the silence itself was alive, a voice, faint but clear, whispered in the back of his mind. "Play it again." Ethan shuddered, the voice almost seeming to come from inside his own thoughts. He froze. The room felt colder now, the shadows stretching further, the air thickening. But the pull of the melody that had haunted him, that had seeped into his very bones, was too strong. He turned the record over, placing it back on the turntable. His hands shook as he lowered the needle. And this time, as the first few notes began to play, the whisper came again. "Play it, forever." The next morning, the sunlight streamed weakly through the cracks in the window blinds, casting narrow beams of pale light across the cluttered floor. Ethan sat at his piano, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping on the keys. The melody from last night was still echoing in his mind, refusing to let go. Every note, every haunting phrase, was ingrained in him like a memory he could never forget. He had barely slept. How could he, with the music still reverberating through his thoughts? He had dreams, nightmares really, where he stood in a fog-covered room, surrounded by shadows that whispered in a language he couldn't understand. The only thing clear was the music, playing endlessly, like it was woven into the very fabric of his dreams. Shaking off the sense of unease, he grabbed his coffee cup and headed for the small, dingy bathroom. His reflection in the mirror looked haggard, eyes bloodshot, face pale, hair a mess. The last few weeks of frustration had taken their toll, but now, after hearing the song, Ethan felt an odd surge of energy, a feeling like he was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. But a nagging voice at the back of his mind told him he shouldn't play the music again. "It's too much," it whispered. "You need to stop." But he couldn't. He knew he couldn't. The song had taken root in him, and the pull to uncover its secrets was too strong. He took a deep breath, splashing cold water on his face before walking back to his piano. He had a job to get to later that afternoon, a performance at one of the dive bars he'd played at countless times before. But for now, the music, the song, called to him. He moved to the turntable and gently lifted the record, the surface cracked and old, but the melody still haunting. As he slid it back into place, the first few notes filled the room, but this time, something was different. There was an intensity in the air, a weight pressing down on him as the melody began. It was almost as if the music was watching him. The room felt smaller, suffocating, and as the song played, he felt himself being drawn into it, like a moth to a flame. The door to his apartment creaked open unexpectedly, breaking his trance. Ethan's head snapped up to see Emily standing there, her brow furrowed. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. "You didn't answer your phone. Are you okay? You've been acting weird lately." Emily, his girlfriend of 3 years, was the only person who seemed to care anymore. She was intelligent, compassionate, and she had always been there for him. But lately, she had begun to notice how distant he had become, how obsessed he was with the piano, with the music. She knew something was off. "I'm fine," Ethan replied a little too quickly, as if to convince both her and himself. He stood up and walked over to her, but his eyes kept flicking to the turntable. He couldn't pull himself away from the music, even with her standing there. Emily noticed his distraction and crossed her arms, watching him carefully. It's not just the music, is it? I can see it in your eyes. You're lost in something, Ethan. It's like you're slipping away. He hesitated, looking down at the floor. He wanted to explain, to tell her about the song, how it had drawn him in, but how could he? She wouldn't understand. No one would. The pull of the music was something he couldn't explain, something beyond rational thought. It felt like it was part of him now. I'm just tired, Ethan muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. I need to focus, on my music. Emily took a step closer, her voice softer now. I get that, but you can't let it take over. You're pushing yourself too hard, and you're pushing us away. I'm not. Ethan began, but his words faltered. He felt the music inside him, pulling, whispering, urging him to return to it. The need to play was overwhelming. Emily looked at him, her expression softening. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm, grounding. Listen to me, Ethan. I love you, but this obsession, it's not healthy. It's scaring me. Ethan felt a pang of guilt at her words. He loved Emily more than anything, and the last thing he wanted was to hurt her. But the song, it was consuming him, and he couldn't fight it anymore. He knew deep down that something was wrong, that the melody was more than just a song, but his need to understand it, to master it, was far too strong. I just need a little more time, he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. Just a little more time to figure it out. Emily sighed, clearly torn. She reached for his hand, holding it gently. Promise me, Ethan. Promise me you'll take a break. You've been drowning in this, and it's not helping you. It's just making everything worse. But even as she spoke, Ethan knew that he couldn't promise her that. How could he? The song had already embedded itself so deeply inside him that there was no turning back. He needed to finish it, to hear the rest of it, to understand its secret. I can't, he said softly, almost to himself. I'm sorry, Emily. She pulled away from him, her face a mixture of frustration and sadness. She took a step back, shaking her head. Fine, she said, her voice tight. But don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Ethan standing there, the room heavy with the weight of his own indecision. The music filled the silence, growing louder, more insistent, as if urging him to continue. And so he did. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan found himself constantly returning to the song, his fingers itching to play it again and again. The melody haunted him in his sleep, in his waking moments, and soon, it became all he could think about. He spent hours at his piano, transcribing the music, trying to decipher the strange patterns hidden within the notes. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't understand why the melody felt so alive. It was as if it wasn't just music, it was something ancient, something far older than the world he knew. One evening, after a particularly long session at the piano, Ethan decided to investigate the origins of the song. He searched the internet for any information about the composer, Sebastian Marlowe, but found little. The man seemed to have disappeared from history entirely, his name buried beneath layers of obscurity. Determined, Ethan visited the local library, hoping to find something that could explain the music's origins. After hours of scouring dusty old books and records, he finally found a single mention of Marlowe in an ancient music journal. The journal described Marlowe as a brilliant, yet tormented composer from the 1700s, known for his strange and unsettling works. But it was one particular piece, the final composition, that had intrigued scholars. The piece was said to have been so haunting, so powerful, that it drove Marlowe to madness. Legend had it that the song was cursed, its very notes capable of ensnaring the souls of those who played it. Ethan's pulse quickened as he read on. The more he learned about Marlowe, the more he realized that the song was more than just a melody. It was a key, a doorway to something dark and unimaginable, something that had been hidden from the world for centuries. He closed the journal, his hands trembling. The song had chosen him, and now there was no going back. The discovery of the journal had given Ethan a surge of excitement, but it also left him with an unsettling sense of dread. Marlowe's music was tied to something far darker than he had anticipated. The haunting melody, the one he couldn't stop playing, wasn't just a forgotten work. It was a cursed creation, a vessel of ancient power. The words ensnaring the souls of those who played it echoed in his mind, causing his pulse to race and his stomach to twist into knots. Still, he couldn't stop. The melody, like a whisper in the back of his mind, demanded to be heard. It beckoned him, coaxed him, pulled him into its orbit, and the more he played it, the more the world outside seemed to disappear. The piano became his only anchor. The world beyond his apartment blurred, losing its relevance. Emily had tried to confront him, tried to pull him back from the edge, but the deeper Ethan fell into the music, the more distant he became from her. His thoughts were no longer clear. They were like the endless stream of notes that spun in his head, a cascade of sound that filled every crevice of his being. That night, Emily came by again, but this time, Ethan didn't answer the door right away. She knocked more urgently this time, the sound piercing through the walls. He felt an odd sense of detachment, as if her presence outside the door was a faint echo, something far less significant than the pull of the song inside him. Finally, the door creaked open. Emily stood in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her body tense with frustration and fear. "Ethan," she started, her voice a little shaky. "Please, we need to talk." Ethan felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming need to return to the piano. The song still beckoned from the other room, calling him like a siren. "Come on, just let me in," she said softly, her voice quiet but firm. Reluctantly, Ethan stepped aside, allowing her into the apartment. But as she crossed the threshold, her gaze was immediately drawn to the turntable. The same record, the one Ethan had found only a few days ago, was spinning on the player, its haunting melody filling the room. "You're still playing it?" Emily asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Ethan, this is madness." He nodded absently, his eyes not meeting hers. The need to play had overtaken him. It had consumed every thought, every inch of his being. But there was something about Emily's voice, something in the way she said his name, that grounded him, pulling him from the fog of obsession for just a moment. "Why can't you just leave it alone?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's changing you. I can feel it. You're not the same. You're not the Ethan I knew." Her words cut deeper than he expected, a small fragment of guilt breaking through the haze. For a brief moment, he almost wanted to stop, to walk away from the piano, to apologize, to tell her the truth. But as soon as his gaze fell on the turntable, the music began to whisper again. It was softer now, but persistent, coaxing him to play, to finish it. I can't, Emily. You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice distant. "You're right," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't understand, but I can see you slipping away, and I can't just watch it happen. Ethan, please stop playing it." He closed his eyes for a moment, gripping the edge of the piano with both hands. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken fears. He could feel her presence behind him, her breath faint against his neck, but he couldn't look at her. Not now. The song was too powerful, its grip on him too tight. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible. "I need to finish it." Without waiting for her response, he turned toward the piano and began to play. His fingers pressed the keys with an urgency he hadn't felt before. The melody swelled, and as the notes filled the room, something else began to happen. The shadows in the corners of the apartment seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally, as if the music itself were pulling at the fabric of reality. Emily stood frozen for a moment, watching him, her face pale with terror. "Ethan, stop," she shouted, her voice shaking. But the words had no effect. Ethan could feel the music overtaking him, seizing control of his body. He wasn't playing the piano anymore. It was as if the piano were playing him. The notes became erratic, chaotic, and the whispers in the background grew louder. The air grew cold, and the shadows in the room began to creep toward him, like tendrils reaching out to pull him into something dark and unknown. Suddenly, Emily stepped forward, her hand reaching out to stop him. She grabbed his wrist, but as soon as her fingers touched his skin, an icy chill ran through her. She recoiled, gasping as if struck by an electric shock. "Ethan, what is happening to you?" she cried. But Ethan didn't answer. He was no longer fully aware of the world around him. The music had taken hold, and all he could hear now were the notes, the endless cascade of sound. He was slipping further into the trance, into the pull of the song, and nothing could stop it. The shadows around him began to swirl, a dark vortex materializing in the center of the room. Emily's voice grew more frantic, but it was drowned out by the oppressive weight of the melody. Ethan's hand moved faster, his fingers no longer following the written notes, but being guided by something else, something ancient. The darkness in the room began to distort the light, the shadows twisting into shapes that were no longer human. Figures began to emerge from the corners of the room, shadowy, indistinct shapes, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Their forms flickered like smoke, but their presence was unmistakable. Emily's heart raced as she backed away from the piano. The air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, and she could feel the pressure in the room tightening, pressing in on her chest. Then, from the depths of the swirling shadows, a voice emerged, low and raspy, like an echo from the past. "You have played the song. Now you belong to it." The room was cold, colder than it had ever been before, and the shadows seemed to press in on Emily from all sides. She turned back to Ethan, her eyes wide with terror. He hadn't stopped playing. His fingers flew across the keys with a frenzied intensity, his expression blank, his face drained of color. Emily's pulse raced. She felt the air around her thick with dread, the walls pressing in like the skin of a coffin. She could hear the whisper of the song now, not just through the turntable, but in the very fabric of the room. It was as if it had seeped into the walls, into the air itself, embedding itself deep into her mind. "Ethan," she whispered, trying to make herself heard above the oppressive sound. Her voice cracked with the weight of fear. "Please stop. Come back to me." But Ethan didn't react. His eyes were glassy, distant. The man she had known was no longer there. Instead, she was staring at a hollow version of him, consumed by the music. His hands moved faster and faster, the keys of the piano echoing in a frantic, almost violent pattern. Suddenly, the shadows around them began to take shape. Figures, distorted in human forms, emerged from the dark corners of the room, their eyes glowing, their bodies shifting unnaturally. They were moving toward Ethan, circling him like vultures around a carcass, drawn to the music. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine as the figures drew closer. They were not human. They were something else, something far older, far darker. Their presence filled the room like a suffocating fog. The song was their gateway, and it was pulling Ethan toward them. "No!" Emily gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to stop him, had to break the trance before it was too late. But how? The figures surrounding Ethan in the room were no longer mere shadows. They had begun to solidify into forms, twisted and alien, their faces distorted by a dark and malevolent energy. Emily's mind raced as she stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Each figure that emerged from the darkness was more grotesque than the last. Some had elongated limbs. Others had mouths that opened too wide, exposing rows of jagged teeth. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their presence was suffocating, like 1,000 whispers crowding her mind at once. The song had summoned them, and they were drawn to Ethan as if he were a beacon. They moved closer, their feet gliding silently over the floor, their forms shifting in and out of focus. The room felt alive with their presence. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. The sound of Ethan's piano playing, a frantic, desperate cascade of notes, echoed in every corner. But the music itself had changed, becoming more erratic, more dissonant, as if it were fighting to break free from the constraints of time and space. The more he played, the more the room warped, as if reality itself was beginning to unravel. Emily's breath hitched as she realized the gravity of the situation. The song had already taken root in Ethan's soul, and these creatures, these dark figures, were the result of that bond. The music was no longer just an obsession. It was a gateway, a portal to something ancient and powerful. The song had opened it, and now these beings were free to come and go at will. Their intent unclear, but undoubtedly malevolent. "Ethan!" Emily cried out, rushing to his side. She reached out to touch his arm, but as soon as her fingers brushed his skin, a shockwave of cold ran through her. The chill was unbearable, as though the very touch of the song had numbed her to the core. She recoiled, her body shivering uncontrollably. He didn't respond. The music, if it could even still be called music, seemed to swell in volume, the dissonant notes warping in time with the figures that circled him. They were feeding off of it, responding to it like parasites to a host. The sound had become their language, their form of communication, and with every passing second, they grew stronger, more tangible. Emily's fear gave way to panic. She had to do something, anything. If she didn't stop this, if she didn't pull Ethan back, there would be no saving him. The music had already taken so much from him, his mind, his spirit. But she knew now that it was more than that. It had already begun to claim him, body and soul. She glanced around the apartment in a desperate search for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on the turntable, the record still spinning, its eerie hum filling the room. Without thinking, she rushed over and grabbed the needle, lifting it off the vinyl. As the needle came off the record, the room seemed to hold its breath. The music stopped, its haunting presence suddenly cut off. The figures froze, their movements stuttering to a halt, as if the very act of silencing the music had interrupted their existence. But only for a moment. Ethan's fingers continued to move on the keys, though now there was no sound. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his expression blank. Emily's heart sank as she realized what was happening. He was no longer even playing the piano. The music had taken over completely, and now it was playing him. The figures in the room began to twitch, their limbs spasming, their mouths opening in a silent scream. Then, with a horrible, bone-chilling sound, the shadows began to lurch toward her, moving faster than any human could comprehend. Their eyes burned brighter, their mouths gaping wider as they advanced. "Ethan!" Emily shouted again, her voice strained with desperation. She reached for him, but the air was thick with a force she couldn't see, a barrier that prevented her from getting any closer. One of the figures, a tall, gaunt creature with a twisted, hollow face, reached out for her, its long, bony fingers stretching toward her neck. She stumbled backward, but there was no escape. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. "Stop it," she cried, her voice cracking. "Ethan, please. Stop playing." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Ethan's fingers stilled. The music stopped. For one brief moment, it felt as though time had frozen. The figures halted their advance, their grotesque faces flickering with what could only be described as uncertainty. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Had she done it? Had she finally reached him? But then, something more terrifying happened. Ethan's eyes snapped open. They were no longer his eyes. The pupils had dilated to an unnatural size, black voids in a sea of pale white. His face was twisted in an eerie smile, one that didn't belong to him. The transformation was subtle at first, his posture shifting, his movements jerky, as though someone or something was controlling his body. But the change was undeniable. It wasn't Ethan anymore. The creature standing in front of her, the thing that had once been Ethan, tilted its head slowly, an unsettling grin stretching across its face. "You should have left him alone," it whispered, its voice not Ethan's but something deeper, older, something far more malevolent. Emily stumbled backward, her heart racing in her chest as she watched the last remnants of Ethan slip away. "You're too late," it continued, the voice growing colder. "He is ours now." The shadows around the room writhed, the figures closing in on her once more, their ghastly forms looming larger. But this time, they weren't just drawn to the music. They were drawn to her. The air around Emily seemed to grow heavier, the darkness closing in tighter with every passing second. Her legs felt weak, her mind racing with panic and confusion. The creature that had once been Ethan, the thing wearing his skin, took a step toward her, its eyes glinting with malicious glee. She didn't have much time. She had to find a way to break the bond, to free Ethan from whatever had taken hold of him. She knew she couldn't reason with the entity now inhabiting his body. This wasn't him anymore. Not completely. And if she didn't act quickly, there would be no way to save him. The song, the forces it had unleashed, would consume him entirely. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help. Her gaze landed on the journal she had seen earlier, the one Ethan had found in the library. It lay discarded on the coffee table, its pages open to the entry about Sebastian Marlowe. The cursed music, the dark history of the piece, it had all been laid out in front of them, but Emily had never truly understood the gravity of what they were dealing with. Now she knew. The song wasn't just an ancient melody. It was a curse, a binding force that anchored its victim to something dark and unholy. It was an invitation, one that had been eagerly accepted by the entity that now wore Ethan's body. She bolted toward the journal, her fingers trembling as she rifled through the pages. There had to be something. There had to be a way to undo the damage. Her eyes skimmed over the text, her mind racing to make sense of the arcane words. And then she found it. A ritual that could break the bond between the music and its victim. It required something precious, a part of the soul, a life force, and the strength to withstand the pull of the song. But as Emily read the instructions, a deep dread settled in her stomach. The ritual was not without cost. She would have to give a part of herself, her own soul, to save Ethan. And even then, the chance of success was slim. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had to make a choice. The creature, the thing wearing Ethan's face, let out a guttural laugh, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. You can't save him. He's ours now. He will never be the same. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But she had no choice. With trembling hands, she began to prepare the ritual. The air was thick with dread. The room pulsed with an oppressive, suffocating energy. The figures that had once circled Ethan now surrounded Emily, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. The malevolent presence of the song, the darkness it had summoned, pressed against her like a physical weight. And then there was Ethan, or what was left of him, standing at the center of the storm. His body moved mechanically, his head jerking at odd angles, as if the thing inhabiting him were testing the limits of its new form. Emily's breath hitched. The thing that had replaced Ethan no longer resembled the man she once knew. His face was twisted, a grotesque mockery of the human form. His lips curled into that same unsettling smile, his eyes too wide, too empty. You think you can stop this? The creature hissed, its voice an eerie echo of Ethan's, distorted by something far darker. You think you can break the song's hold? Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was too focused on the journal in front of her, on the ritual that she had no choice but to complete. Her hands shook as she clutched the tattered pages. The instructions were there, clear and precise, but the weight of them bore down on her. She was about to make a choice that could cost her everything. The ritual required an exchange, a sacrifice that would sever the connection between Ethan and the entity controlling him. But it wasn't a simple spell or incantation. The ritual called for a fragment of the soul, a willing offering to tear the bond asunder. The sacrifice would create an opening, a path through which Ethan could be freed from the darkness. But Emily knew it was dangerous. The song had already taken so much from him, and she could feel it creeping into her own mind, trying to latch onto her. The music itself wasn't just a melody, it was alive. It fed off of fear, of desperation, and it would stop at nothing to claim its victims. Her eyes flicked to Ethan again, his empty gaze locked on her, his fingers twitching as if he were still playing the piano. The figures behind him began to move again, slowly, deliberately, their forms stretching and shifting with each step they took. You can't win, the creature whispered again, its voice a hissing growl. This is his fate now, and it will be yours soon enough. Emily could feel the coldness of the room seep into her bones. The presence of the figures, the dark entities, felt suffocating. They were closing in, and she knew time was running out. She had to do it now. Clutching the journal to her chest, she turned to the small altar she had prepared, candles lit in a circle, the symbols scrawled across the floor in chalk as the ritual dictated. There was a deep, guttural hum vibrating in the air, a resonance that matched the pulsing of her heartbeat. The figures stopped moving, now watching her closely, their glowing eyes fixated on her every motion. In the center of the circle, she placed a small knife, the blade sharp, silver, and cold. It gleamed ominously in the low light. The ritual demanded a blood sacrifice, a way to anchor the severing of the bond between Ethan and the creature. But Emily knew the true cost would be much greater than just a drop of her blood. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the rising tide of fear. The music in the background swelled again, louder this time, louder than before. Her vision blurred as the song threatened to pull her into its depths. She could hear it now, like a voice whispering just beyond the edge of her hearing. It was insistent, seductive, coaxing her to stop, to let it take control, to let it claim her as it had claimed Ethan. "You are mine." The song seemed to murmur, its voice dripping with malice. "You cannot escape me." Her hands shook, but she clenched her fists and stepped forward, forcing herself to ignore the words. She had no choice. Ethan was slipping away, and the price she would pay was the only way to pull him back from the brink. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. She turned toward him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "I won't let you go. Not like this." Ethan, or whatever was in his body now, let out a low, eerie chuckle, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "It's too late for you, Emily. He is lost." Ignoring the creature, Emily stepped into the center of the ritual circle and placed the blade against her palm. She hesitated for only a moment, knowing that once she made this choice, there would be no turning back. She pressed down, the blade cutting through her skin with a sharp, almost painful precision. Blood dripped onto the floor, pooling in the center of the circle. The symbols on the ground glowed for a moment, and the air around her seemed to shift. The humming noise grew louder, vibrating through her very bones as if the ritual had begun to take effect. The creatures began to shriek, their distorted forms lurching forward, their eyes burning with rage. The song's presence grew stronger, more insistent, filling every corner of the room with a chaotic symphony of discordant notes. But Emily held her ground. She had no choice. With a final, desperate cry, she recited the incantation from the journal. Her voice cracked as the words left her lips, each syllable hanging in the air like an invisible thread binding the ritual together. "By the blood and by the soul," she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "I sever the ties that bind us. I break the chain. Free him from the darkness. Free him from you." The moment the last word left her mouth, the room seemed to explode. The air shimmered with a blinding light, and the figures that had once circled Ethan shrieked, their bodies contorting in agony as they were torn from the fabric of reality. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and the music, the song, howled in fury as it was ripped from Ethan's body. Ethan's hands fell to his sides, his fingers limp against the keys. The possessed, twisted expression on his face began to fade, replaced by the vacant, confused look of someone emerging from a deep fog. The creatures dissolved into the air, their forms vanishing as the light from the ritual consumed them. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, and the music fell silent. And then there was stillness. Ethan stood motionless, his body trembling, his eyes blinking as though trying to adjust to the reality around him. He looked down at his hands, confused. His gaze slowly moved up to meet Emily's. "Emily." His voice was weak, shaky, as if he had been lost for years and was only just finding his way back. Tears welled up in her eyes as she took a step forward. She reached for him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan, I'm here. You're safe." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, he collapsed into her arms, his body shaking with exhaustion. I don't understand," he murmured, his voice soft and broken. What happened? Emily held him tight, her own tears falling freely now. You were lost, she whispered, but I brought you back. You're safe now. We're gonna get through this. But deep inside, she knew that their victory had come at a cost. The song was gone, for now, but its influence still lingered in the air, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. And Emily knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The apartment was eerily silent, save for the soft sound of Ethan's labored breathing as he clung to Emily for support. The tension in the air had finally dissipated, the heavy atmosphere that had weighed down on them now lifting like a dense fog clearing after a storm. But the silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a much larger storm. Emily's heart was still pounding in her chest, her pulse racing in the aftermath of the ritual. She had done it. She had saved Ethan. Or had she? The question gnawed at her, lingering in the back of her mind as she helped Ethan to his feet, her hands trembling as she guided him to the couch. His once vibrant eyes were now hollow with exhaustion, and his movements were slow, deliberate, as if every muscle in his body had been drained of energy. His face was pale, his skin slick with a cold sweat, and there were dark bags under his eyes, signs of the toll the possession had taken. She couldn't imagine what he had gone through, how long he had been under the influence of the song. The music had been a constant presence in their lives for months, but she knew now it had been much more than just a haunting melody. It was a living entity, feeding off of Ethan's soul, manipulating him, twisting him. The weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it aside. For now, Ethan needed her. He had to know he was safe. You're okay, she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. You're back with me. You're safe. Ethan stared at her, his eyes unfocused. I don't remember everything. His voice was hoarse, as if speaking itself was an effort. How did you do it? Emily took a shaky breath, sitting down beside him. I had to perform the ritual, she said softly, her voice trembling. It wasn't easy. I had to sacrifice a part of myself to sever the bond, to free you. Ethan's face twisted in confusion and fear. A part of yourself? What did you do? What did it cost you? Emily hesitated. She hadn't told him everything. She hadn't told him the full price of the ritual, not yet. The journal had been clear. The ritual required not only a fragment of the soul, but also the strength to endure the song's influence. To complete it, she had to confront the darkness within herself. She wasn't sure if she had truly succeeded in that, or if the music's influence had planted something deeper inside her, something that might one day resurface. But she couldn't burden Ethan with that now. He needed to heal, to recover from the horrors he had endured. I'm fine, she lied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We're both fine. We've made it through the worst of it. Ethan didn't look convinced. He reached out for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Emily, please. I don't understand what happened to me. To us. Emily's throat tightened, but she squeezed his hand, trying to comfort him. You were under the influence of the song, she explained gently. It was controlling you. The figures you saw, the darkness you felt, they were all a part of it. But you're free now. It's over. For a moment, Ethan was silent, his eyes unfocused as if he were lost in thought. Then, with a shudder, he looked at her again. But the song, it still feels like it's here. It's still inside me, Emily. I can hear it. A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. The very thought of the song, of its power, sent a ripple of dread through her. You're just hearing things, she said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. The song's gone. The ritual worked. The bond is broken. But even as she spoke, she could feel it too, a faint hum, like a distant melody, just at the edge of her consciousness. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't clear, but it was there. The song hadn't disappeared. It hadn't gone away, and it was still trying to reach them. Later that night, as Emily lay awake beside Ethan, her mind raced with the implications of what they had done. The room was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of the old apartment building. The air felt different, like something was waiting, something was watching. She could hear it now, the faintest whisper of the song, drifting in and out of her thoughts. It wasn't clear enough to make sense of, but it was undeniable. It was like the song had become a part of her, its presence lingering in her mind, even though she had done everything she could to banish it. Ethan, asleep beside her, was no better off. His breathing was shallow, his face twisted with discomfort, as if the very act of rest was painful for him. And Emily knew that what she had done to save him had come at a greater cost than either of them had realized. The ritual had severed the bond between Ethan and the dark forces that had consumed him, but it hadn't destroyed the song. No, the song wasn't something that could be destroyed so easily. It was alive, ancient, and far more powerful than they could have imagined. And now it was embedded in their very souls. Emily closed her eyes, trying to shut out the soft hum that was starting to echo in the back of her mind. She had to think. There had to be a way to finish this, to destroy the song once and for all. If it was still alive inside them, then it was only a matter of time before it resurfaced. But how? The following morning, Emily woke to an uncomfortable heaviness in the pit of her stomach. Ethan was still asleep beside her, but the signs of his restlessness had only deepened in the hours since they'd last spoken. His brow was furrowed, his face pale and drawn. It was as though sleep had not given him the peace it should have. The quiet hum of the song was louder now, more insistent, gnawing at her senses. Emily had tried to ignore it, to push it away, but it wouldn't let her. It was like an itch she couldn't scratch, a constant presence, lurking in the depths of her mind. As she rose from the bed and moved toward the kitchen, she saw that the old turntable was still sitting in the corner of the room. The vinyl record they had destroyed, the one that had begun it all, was still resting there, waiting. The memory of it, of the music, filled her thoughts as she stared at the object. It felt wrong. It felt like the very presence of the song had taken root in the apartment, in their lives, in everything they touched. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Emily froze. She hadn't expected any visitors. The world outside felt distant, disconnected from the nightmare they had just survived. But there was again another knock. Her heart skipped a beat. "I'll get it," Ethan mumbled groggily from behind her. Before she could stop him, Ethan shuffled toward the door, rubbing his eyes. As he opened it, Emily's breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall, dark, and foreboding. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was Sebastian Marlowe, the name from the journal, the composer, the man whose music had begun this entire nightmare. But this wasn't the man she'd seen in the book. This was something more, something twisted and ancient, its eyes gleaming with an unearthly light. "I see you've been playing my song," the figure said with a sinister smile. "It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? The way it moves through you, takes root, and becomes part of who you are." Emily's blood ran cold. The song was back, and this time, it wasn't leaving. The moment Sebastian Marlowe stepped into the apartment, the temperature seemed to drop. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the man, or whatever he was, loomed in the doorway, his presence overwhelming and unsettling. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural intensity, locked onto hers. The faint hum of the song pulsed in the background, vibrating through the air like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The same song, the one that had taken so much from them, was now alive in the room, filling every inch of the space, invading every thought. "So," Marlowe's voice was smooth, velvety, like the calm before a storm. "You managed to survive, I see. But did you think you could truly be rid of me?" Ethan staggered backward, his face drained of color. His hands instinctively went to his head, as if trying to block out the growing hum that filled the room. No, this can't be real. You can't be here. You're dead." Marlowe chuckled, a deep, hollow sound that reverberated off the walls. He stepped further into the apartment, his presence consuming the space around him. He seemed almost to float, his movements unervingly smooth, like he was above the laws of physics. His dark eyes flicked from Ethan to Emily, then back to the turntable in the corner of the room. "Dead?" Marlowe echoed, his grin widening. "Oh, my dear boy, you are mistaken. You see, the song I created is no mere composition. It is a vessel, a doorway, It can bring the dead back to life, but only in a form far more powerful than you could ever imagine. Ethan's eyes widened with horror as realization dawned on him. The song, it wasn't just music, it was a ritual. Emily felt a chill spread through her as the weight of Marlowe's words sank in. Her hands tightened into fists, her body instinctively tensing. What are you talking about? What do you want from us? Marlowe's smile never wavered as he looked directly at her. I want what is mine, he said, his voice low and filled with something ancient. I want my song to be heard. I want it to resonate in the hearts of all who hear it. I want its power to spread, and I want you to help me make that happen. The floor beneath Emily's feet seemed to tremble slightly, as if the very room was alive with the pulse of the song's power. The music was growing louder, almost overwhelming, thrumming beneath the surface of her consciousness. No, Emily said, shaking her head, a shiver running down her spine. We won't help you. You've already taken too much. Ethan's barely recovering. He's not your pawn anymore. Marlowe tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Your defiance is admirable, but ultimately futile, he said, stepping closer, his cold fingers brushing against the edge of the turntable. The song cannot be silenced. It was never just about you, Ethan. It was never just about your little rebellion. The song is ancient, older than you can imagine. It is part of something much bigger than both of you. And now that I'm here, you will play your part. Before Emily could respond, she saw the air around Marlowe shift, dark tendrils of shadow swirling around his feet. The temperature plummeted further, and the room seemed to warp and bend in ways that defied logic. The edges of the walls blurred, like she was looking through a foggy window. The song, the music, seemed to grow louder, more aggressive, demanding her attention, pulling her into its web once more. Marlowe continued, his voice like a siren's call, luring her into submission. You think you can fight me? You think you can resist the song's pull? You don't understand. The song is not just a creation, it is a force of nature. It's part of something far greater than anything you could ever conceive. And now that you're connected to it, Emily's heart raced. She could feel it, the darkness, the weight of the song pressing down on her chest. It was no longer a distant hum. It was invading her mind. And as much as she tried to resist, she could feel herself slipping. The pull was undeniable, seductive in its power. Her vision blurred as images flashed in her mind. A room full of rotting corpses, twisted, broken bodies bound by strings like marionettes, all moving in unison to the tune of the song. A flood of memories from Ethan's possession. The faces of the figures, the cold, the loss, spilled into her thoughts like a torrent. No, Emily whispered, trying to fight it. She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing on the warmth of Ethan's presence beside her, his steadying hand on her arm. She couldn't fall back into the darkness. Not again. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. Emily, don't listen to him. We've beaten him before. We could do it again, together. But Emily wasn't sure if they could anymore. She could feel the song, a twisted, all-encompassing force, gripping her mind, trying to take root inside her, to corrupt her. Marlowe's laughter echoed in her ears. Together, he mocked. There is no together, Emily. There is only the song. You cannot escape it. You cannot resist it. And soon, you will join me. The room seemed to pulse with the force of Marlowe's presence, the very air thick with an electric charge. The song, the haunting, sinister melody, played in the background, louder now, like it was coming from every direction, filling every corner of the room. Ethan's hand gripped Emily's wrist, his fingers cold, but his voice was firm, laced with the desperation of someone who knew they were running out of time. Emily, he said urgently, we have to fight back. We can't let him win. We can't let him take control again. Emily's heart was hammering in her chest. She could feel the pressure building, the oppressive weight of Marlowe's power seeping into her very thoughts. The music was getting louder, its rhythm pulsing in her veins like blood. But Ethan was right. She couldn't give in. She couldn't let the song consume her again. But as much as she wanted to resist, the truth was inescapable. The song had a power that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was alive, insidious, and it wanted to claim them both. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to push through the growing sense of dread. "We have to break the cycle," she said, determination creeping back into her voice. "We have to destroy the song once and for all." Ethan nodded, though his eyes were filled with doubt. "But how? We've already tried everything. What more is there left to do?" Marlowe smiled, his face twisted in delight. "You don't get it, do you? You can't destroy the song. You can only control it or become its vessel." Emily's gaze flicked to the turntable. The record was still there, the very thing that had started it all, the key to Marlowe's twisted power. If they could somehow destroy the source, destroy the song, they might have a chance. But how could they defeat something that had been woven into the very fabric of their existence? "It's not over," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We can still stop this. I won't let it take us." With a glance at Ethan, they both knew what they had to do. They had to face the music Eden. The oppressive weight of the song seemed to stretch across every inch of the room, enveloping them in its dark, suffocating presence. Emily could feel the pull deep inside her chest, as if the music itself was trying to tear her apart from the inside. The very air vibrated with the tune, its cadence relentless, impossible to ignore. Ethan's grip on her wrist tightened, pulling her back to reality. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wide with panic. But there was something in them, something more than fear, resolve. They couldn't let the song win. "No," Ethan muttered under his breath, as if trying to convince himself as much as Emily. "No, we're not going to let him take us again. Not now, not after everything." Emily nodded, though the trembling in her hands betrayed her uncertainty. The ritual had not been enough. The song, like an insidious parasite, had burrowed its way into the very core of their beings. It had come back stronger, with Marlowe at its helm, twisting everything they had fought for into something darker, more dangerous. But Emily couldn't accept this. She wouldn't. As her eyes flicked to the turntable, she saw Marlowe standing near it, his long fingers dancing across the vinyl with a twisted sort of reverence. His smile was cold, and his voice carried the same haunting melody that had been plaguing their minds for so long. "It's already too late," Marlowe said softly, his voice seeping into their thoughts like an intoxicating drug. "You cannot escape the song. You never could." Emily swallowed hard. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him claim any more of their souls. "You're wrong," Emily spat, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We're not your puppets. We're not going to be your vessels." Marlowe's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he regained his composure. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now tinged with something darker, something that made Emily's skin crawl. "The song is not just a melody, not just a creation of sound. It is a conduit, a gateway. It was never just about taking your souls. It's about bringing something else into this world. Something ancient, something powerful. And once it's here, it cannot be stopped." A sickening chill ran down Emily's spine as she realized the full scope of the danger they were facing. It was worse than they had thought. This wasn't just about the song. It was about something far older, something far more malevolent. Ethan's face hardened with determination. "Whatever it is, we'll stop it. We'll destroy the song. We won't let you use us to bring whatever this is into our world." Marlowe tilted his head, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "You think you can destroy it?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You think you can simply silence it? The song has been with me for centuries, and it will remain, even after you are gone. It is beyond your understanding." Emily's thoughts raced. She had to stop him. They had to stop this, no matter the cost. But how? How could they destroy something that was not just music, but a force of nature itself? Then it hit her. The journal. The ritual. There had been a passage in the book, something about the true source of the song. She had only read it once, but she could still remember the words. It spoke of an object, an artifact, that had been used to create the song in the first place. If they could find it, destroy it, perhaps they could sever the connection once and for all. Her eyes snapped to Marlowe, her voice firm as she spoke. "The song didn't start with you," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "There's something else, something more powerful behind it. You're not the creator, Marlowe. You're just a pawn." Marlowe's expression faltered, just for a moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached up and brushed a finger against his lips, his smile returning with an eerie calm. "You think you know the full story?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "You think you can control it? The song's power is not just mine to wield. It's a force that has existed long before any of you. And now, it is too late. It has already begun." Before Emily or Ethan could react, the walls of the apartment seemed to tremble again, a deep rumble vibrating through the floor. The hum of the song reached a deafening crescendo, and for a moment, the room seemed to warp around them, distorted, like the edges of a dream about to shatter. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. Ethan and Emily exchanged confused, worried glances. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, momentarily, but the sense of something wrong, something impending, lingered. Marlowe was gone. The apartment felt different. The air seemed thicker, as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched taut and was about to snap. The quiet hum of the song was gone, but its presence still loomed in the shadows of their minds. "What just happened?" Ethan asked, his voice tight, still reeling from the strange, suffocating presence that had consumed them moments ago. "I don't know," Emily whispered. "But whatever it was, it isn't over. We can't let our guard down." They stood in the middle of the room, the silence pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Emily's thoughts raced. The song wasn't just a piece of music. It was an entity, an ancient force that couldn't be easily destroyed. And Marlowe? He was just its vessel, its agent. She had to stop him. They had to finish this once and for all. But to do that, they needed to find the source. The oppressive silence in the apartment was suffocating as Emily and Ethan worked together to formulate a plan. The air still held the lingering echo of the song, faint and insidious, as though it was waiting for the right moment to strike again. They couldn't ignore the fact that Marlowe had come so close to winning. He had almost brought them both back under his control. But Emily wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. Ethan stood by the turntable, staring at the record that still lay upon it. His face was pale, the exhaustion from their battle still weighing heavily on him. He had been through so much. They both had. "We need to destroy the source," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We need to find out what started this all. There has to be something, some clue we missed." Ethan nodded, still lost in thought. "You think it's connected to Marlowe's past? Maybe there's more to him than we know." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She thought back to the journal she had found, the pages filled with cryptic references to Marlowe's origins. She had never fully understood it, but there was one part that stood out, an old, faded photograph of Marlowe standing beside what looked like an ancient, ornate box. The photograph had been tucked into the back of the journal, almost as if it were meant to be overlooked. But Emily had sensed there was something important about it. She had to see it again. She had to understand what it meant. Without a word, she grabbed the journal from the shelf and flipped through the yellowed pages. She found the photograph, the one that had always made her uneasy. Marlowe, standing in front of an old stone building. The box, an object of power, shimmering with a strange, unnatural light, was positioned at the center of the frame. This is it," Emily whispered, her fingers trembling as she traced the image. "This is what started it. Whatever's inside that box. It's the key." The air in the apartment still held the remnants of Marlowe's presence, a subtle tension lingering in every corner. But the immediate threat seemed to have receded. For now, Emily felt an uneasy calm, like the silence before the storm. She stared at the photograph in the journal, her mind racing. The box in the picture wasn't just some artifact. It was a key to unlocking the song's true power. Ethan, standing beside her, his eyes weary but alert, glanced over her shoulder. "That box, it's more than just a relic. It's connected to the song, isn't it?" Emily nodded, her heart racing as she turned the page in the journal. "There's something in here about the box. It's not just an object. It's a vessel. Marlowe didn't create the song, but he found it, or it found him. This box is where the song's power originates." A chill crept up Emily's spine. "We need to find it. The image of the box, the object pulsing with an unnatural energy, locked in time beside a younger Marlowe, haunted her thoughts. The answer to stopping the song was tied to it, but where could they even begin looking? The journal gave them little more than cryptic clues, hints scattered across pages filled with strange symbols and references to places that no longer existed. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice low, steady. "Marlowe can't be far from that box. If he finds it first." Emily felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy blanket. If Marlowe found the box and unlocked its full power, there would be no stopping him. There would be no escaping the grip of the song. They couldn't wait any longer. They had to find it first. "Let's go," Emily said, determination returning to her voice. "We can't wait for him to make his next move. We need to get ahead of him." The sun was setting as they drove down a narrow, winding road that led out of the city. Emily clutched the journal tightly in her lap, her eyes scanning the pages one more time for any detail they might have missed. The photograph of Marlowe stood out against the cluttered text, its ancient and cryptic aura almost mocking her. The box was buried deep in the pages, described only as a relic of the void, a gate to realms unseen. The words swirled in her mind like smoke, impossible to grasp fully. But one thing was clear. Whatever it wasn't meant to be found. "We're getting close," Ethan muttered, his eyes flicking between the road and the map they had managed to decipher. They had found a reference to a location from the journal, a place hidden in the mountains, long abandoned, where Marlowe had once sought the box years ago. The path grew steeper, the trees closing in around them, until it felt as though they were entering the heart of the wilderness, far removed from civilization. A haunting sense of isolation hung in the air. The world seemed distant here, nothing but them and the road. Their only company the growing tension between them and the mystery of the box. The road came to an abrupt end at the base of an old, crumbling stone building, its silhouette stark against the dimming sky. The structure was ancient, its walls overgrown with vines, and the windows shattered like broken eyes staring into the darkness. This was it, the place from the journal, the location where Marlowe had first uncovered the box. "Is this it?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe and dread. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "This is it. Let's find the box before Marlowe does." They approached cautiously, the weight of the air around them growing heavier the closer they got to the building. The hum of the song was faint, almost imperceptible, but Emily could feel its presence deep in her bones. It was waiting, watching. Inside, the building was dark and musty, the smell of decay thick in the air. The only light came from the dim glow of their flashlights, casting long shadows across the ruined interior. The stone walls were covered in faded murals, strange, otherworldly scenes depicting figures wrapped in chains, surrounded by dark shapes and endless spirals. A sense of unease washed over them as they moved deeper into the structure. "This place feels wrong," Emily said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. The atmosphere pressed in on them, suffocating, as though the building itself were alive, breathing with a malevolent presence. Ethan's eyes scanned the room. "Stay close. We don't know what's down here." They descended a crumbling staircase that led to a lower level. The walls were damp, and the air grew colder as they moved farther underground. At the base of the stairs, they found a large, vaulted chamber, its stone floor cracked and uneven. In the center of the room, standing on a stone pedestal, was the box. It was smaller than Emily had expected, only about the size of a large chest, but it radiated an unsettling energy. The box itself was intricately carved, its surface marked with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. It pulsed with a rhythm, as if alive, as if the song emanated from within. The hum was stronger now, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air around them. It was unmistakable. The song was inside the box, and it wanted to escape. "There it is," Emily breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, his hand hovering just above the box. "How do we destroy it?" Emily's mind raced. The journal hadn't given them any answers. The ritual for the box was never fully described, only hints of its power and how it could unlock the doors to something far more dangerous than Marlowe's possession. But Emily had to try. They had no choice. "If we can't destroy it directly," she murmured, "maybe we can disrupt its connection to the song. We need to break the seal. It's the only way." The box seemed to respond to her words, its pulsing glow intensifying, like it was aware of their presence. Ethan reached for the lid, but as his fingers brushed the surface, a shock of energy shot through him, sending him staggering back. "No," a voice rasped, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marlowe! He was here. They were too late. The whisper of Marlowe's voice sent a shiver down Emily's spine. His presence filled the air, suffocating and unyielding, as if he were a shadow that had woven itself into the very fabric of the room. Ethan staggered back, his hands shaking as the shock of energy from the box lingered at his fingertips. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his breath quickening. The low, guttural whisper echoed in their minds again, and this time it was louder, closer. "You think you can stop me?" The words felt like a pressure in Emily's chest, suffocating her thoughts. She looked around frantically, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no sign of Marlowe. He wasn't visible. But that didn't mean he wasn't here. The song was his vessel. And now, with the box in front of them, its hum growing louder and more insistent. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. The room had grown impossibly colder, and the faint, glowing symbols on the box pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if the box was alive and aware of them. It beckoned. "Ethan," Emily said, her voice low and filled with fear. "We need to break it. We have to destroy it now, before it's too late." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "Right, but how?" Emily glanced back at the journal, flipping through the pages with urgency. She needed something, anything, that could give them a chance. Her fingers froze on a page where a series of symbols were written in the margins, and in the corner, there was a small drawing of the box. The writing next to the drawing wasn't much clearer, but the symbols appeared to form some sort of pattern. Emily squinted, trying to decipher the code. Her pulse quickened as she realized what it meant. This is a key," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to unlock it, break the seals, but we need to reverse the ritual. We can't destroy it directly, but we can keep it from fully activating." Ethan's eyes widened. "You think it's that simple?" Emily wasn't sure. The fear gnawing at her gut told her it wasn't, but they didn't have time to hesitate. The song was getting louder. She could feel it vibrating through her bones now, its rhythm syncing with her heartbeat. "Help me," she urged, her hands trembling as she tried to trace the symbols from the journal onto the surface of the box. "We need to stop it before Marlowe uses it." As she traced the first symbol, the box responded. The hum intensified, and for a split second, it felt like something was watching them from within the box. Something dark and unfathomable. Emily's skin crawled, her mind reeling from the sensation. Ethan stepped closer, his hand hovering just above the box as if afraid to touch it again. "Emily, we're not alone in here," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Something's wrong." Before she could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, and a deafening, high-pitched shriek echoed through the chamber. The walls cracked, the ceiling groaning as if the building itself was coming to life. The box was reacting, pulling at the air around them with an insatiable hunger. "No, it's too late. You can't stop it." Marlowe's voice rang out again, his tone filled with glee. His presence was palpable now, swirling in the air around them like a thick fog. Emily's heart raced. She had to finish this. She couldn't let Marlowe take them again. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and with one final push, she pressed the last symbol onto the surface of the box. The air around them crackled with energy, the sound of the song ringing louder in their ears as the box began to shake violently. The glowing symbols on its surface flared to life, sending tendrils of light spiraling into the room. It felt as though the very room was being torn apart by the force of the box. Then, as if in response to Emily's actions, the box released an agonizing, bone-chilling scream. The energy built to a crescendo, and for a split second, it felt as though the world itself was on the brink of collapse. Suddenly, the room went still. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Emily and Ethan stood frozen, their breath shallow, eyes wide as they waited for the next moment. Had they succeeded? Or had they merely delayed the inevitable? And then they heard it, a faint scratching sound, like something moving beneath the stone floor. A low growl echoed in the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Marlowe, his form began to materialize, stepping from the shadows as though he had been summoned by the very forces they had disturbed. His face was twisted, his eyes hollow, dark as night. His expression was one of fury, but also something far more terrifying, an insatiable hunger. "You think you can stop me?" Marlowe's voice was barely a whisper, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You're too late." Before Emily or Ethan could react, Marlowe lunged at them, his movements too fast, too inhuman. The room seemed to warp around him, as if he were bending reality to his will. Ethan reached out, grabbing Emily's wrist and pulling her toward the doorway. "Move!" he shouted, his voice desperate. They didn't have much time. The room was collapsing. The walls seemed to buckle in on themselves, the ground cracking beneath them. The energy that had been released from the box was growing stronger, warping reality itself. They sprinted through the crumbling building, Marlowe's footsteps echoing behind them, the air growing colder with each passing second. They had to get out before it was too late. The exit was just ahead, but the room seemed to stretch further, as if they were running in a maze. Every corner, every hallway twisted into another, as though the building itself was playing tricks on them, refusing to let them escape. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder, only to see Marlowe's figure closing in on them. His face was a grotesque mask of rage, his hands reaching out, his fingers elongated and claw-like. And then, through the haze of panic, something strange happened. The box began to hum again, its song rising from the depths of the building. But this time it was different. The hum was no longer just a melody. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with Emily's own. The room blurred. The world around them seemed to twist, and the sound of the song became louder, more deafening. The walls themselves were warping, distorting, as if the song was opening a doorway to another place, another reality. "No!" Emily screamed, her voice lost in the chaos. But it was too late. The world around them twisted, bent under the weight of the song. The walls shimmered, distorting like rippling water, and the air itself seemed to stretch, elongating as though it were being pulled by invisible hands. The humming of the box grew louder, deeper, vibrating through their bones until it felt like a tangible force, pressing against them, threatening to crush them under its weight. "Keep moving," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of the song. His grip on Emily's wrist tightened as they sprinted through the shifting hallways, the ground beneath them unstable, the building itself groaning as if it were on the verge of collapse. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let Marlowe win. Not like this. Behind them, Marlowe's footsteps echoed, his voice slipping through the chaos like a whisper in the wind. "You can't escape. This place, this moment. It's all mine." His words were like daggers cutting through their resolve. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing him grow nearer. His face was now a twisted mask of desperation and hunger, his eyes dark pools of malevolent intent. His fingers were elongated, claws scraping along the stone as he pursued them relentlessly. And the song, its rhythm was no longer just a melody. It was a pulse, a heartbeat that seemed to sync with Marlowe's own. It was as though the very fabric of the world was bending to his will, folding in on itself. "Ethan, we have to get out of here," Emily cried, her voice thick with panic. "The song, it's not just the box anymore. It's everywhere." He nodded, pulling her faster, but the hallway seemed endless, stretching into an abyss. The door they had entered through was now impossibly far away, lost in the shifting maze of the crumbling building. "Marlowe!" He's not just trying to escape, Ethan said, his voice tight with realization. He's trying to bring the song into this world. The box, whatever's inside it, is just a gateway. He's using it to tear open a rift. Emily's mind raced as the weight of his words sank in. Marlowe wasn't merely after the box anymore. He was trying to force its power into the real world, to bring the chaos and horror of the song into existence, to reshape reality itself. Then we have to stop him, she said, her voice cold with determination. We can't let him open that rift. We have to find a way to seal it. But as they rounded another corner, they were met with an unexpected sight. At the end of the hallway, where the light flickered and the walls bled shadows, stood an open doorway. Beyond it was a cavernous, dark expanse, the source of the song's energy, a place that felt ancient and wrong. The doorway pulsed with the same eerie rhythm that had taken over the building. It was the heart of the rift. We can't go in there, Ethan said, his voice strained. That's where the song. It's coming from, but Emily knew they had no choice. Marlowe was getting closer, and the only way to stop him was to confront whatever lay within that dark expanse. They had to stop the song's source before it consumed everything. Let's go, Emily said, her resolve hardening. We don't have time. They ran toward the doorway, their footsteps barely audible over the shrill wail of the song that filled the air. The closer they got, the heavier the air became, thick with the energy of the rift. The world around them seemed to bend, and time itself felt warped, as if they were stepping into another reality entirely. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, his eyes filled with dread. What if we can't close it? What if it's too late? Emily's gaze locked on the dark void ahead. We don't have a choice. As they stepped into the rift, the world shifted. The air grew colder, the shadows around them stretching unnaturally. The ground beneath their feet felt soft and shifting, like walking on a surface that wasn't quite solid. And then they heard it, the song. But it wasn't just a melody anymore. It was a cacophony, a symphony of chaos, a collection of voices all screaming in unison. The song was alive, breathing, reaching out to them. From the darkness emerged shapes, twisting, contorting, their forms not quite human. They were fragments of the song, pieces of the madness that the box had unleashed, and they moved toward Emily and Ethan, their eyes glowing with a hunger that mirrored Marlowe's. You cannot stop it. Marlowe's voice echoed in their minds, surrounding them like 1,000 whispers. The song is eternal. It will consume everything. Emily's heart raced as the shadows closed in on them. We can stop it, she muttered under her breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. We have to. She pulled the journal from her bag, flipping to the page where she had seen the final symbol, the one that might be the key to sealing the rift. The energy around her crackled, the song's shrill wail deafening as she traced the symbol in the air. Ethan stood beside her, his eyes scanning the darkness, his body tensed, ready for whatever would come next. Hurry, he whispered. We don't have much time. The shadows reached out, tendrils of darkness lashing toward them. But just as they were about to strike, Emily spoke the words from the journal, an incantation, a final prayer to close the rift. For a moment, nothing happened. The song seemed to grow louder, more powerful, as though it were fighting back against them. The creatures surrounding them hissed and snarled, their forms warping as they moved closer, hungry for their souls. Then, with a sudden, violent pulse, the energy around them shattered. The shadows screamed, their forms dissipating into the air, and the rift began to close. The song faltered, its power weakening as the dark doorway shrank, its grip loosening on reality. But then, just as Emily thought they might have won, a voice broke through the chaos, a voice filled with rage. You think you've won? Marlowe's figure appeared, his form now twisted beyond recognition, his body writhing with dark energy, a grotesque mockery of the man he had once been. The song pulsed around him, feeding him, strengthening him. He was no longer just human. He had become something more, something far darker. This is my world now, Marlowe hissed, his eyes glowing with malevolent power. And you will be nothing but echoes in it. Marlowe's voice reverberated through the rift, distorted and guttural, as though it came from the depths of a nightmare. His body twisted unnaturally, his skin stretched tight over his bones, the once human features now barely recognizable. His eyes were black voids, the darkness inside them swirling like a storm. "You shouldn't have tried to stop me," he hissed, his voice echoing all around them, bouncing off the walls of the shifting rift. "The song is mine now, and you are nothing but its prey." Emily's breath hitched in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She knew they had to act fast. There was no time left to hesitate. The rift was still closing, the incantation she had spoken beginning to take effect, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The song, that awful melody, still filled the air, growing louder by the second. And the shapes, those creatures made of the song's power, were moving closer, their grotesque forms undulating in the air. Their eyes glowed with a hunger that sent a chill through Emily's bones. But Marlowe, twisted and ravenous, was the true threat. "You think you can stop me?" Marlowe's lips curled into a twisted grin. "I've become something beyond your understanding. I have seen the truth behind the song, felt its power, and now I will bring it to you, to the world." The rift pulsed again, and the creatures shifted toward Emily and Ethan, their forms leaching into the air around them, like shadows come to life. Every inch of the space around them was distorted by the song, and the very fabric of reality seemed to tremble, as if the world itself was being eaten alive. Ethan reached for the journal, holding it tightly in his hands. "Emily, we need to finish this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have much time before the rift fully closes. If we can't stop Marlowe, we will stop him," Emily said, cutting him off. "We have to." The words from the journal danced in her mind, desperate, fragmented instructions about sealing the rift, about reversing the ritual. The symbols she had traced in the air, the incantation, they were only part of the answer. But the box, it was the key. The box had to be destroyed completely. Emily's eyes flicked to Marlowe, his form now distorting further, bending and writhing as if the song itself was eating away at him. His body was half-formed, caught between the human and something far worse. He wasn't truly in control anymore. The song had taken him, made him its vessel. "No one will stop me," Marlowe growled, his hands stretching toward them, the claws of his fingers glistening with malice. "Not you. Not anyone." He lunged at them, his movements unnatural, a blur of darkness and rage. His hand reached out, an impossibly long arm, aiming to strike Emily. But before he could get close, a blinding light exploded from the center of the room, sending him staggering back with a scream. It was the box. The song inside it was reacting, fighting back against Marlowe's twisted form. The box on the pedestal glowed brighter than ever, its symbols pulsating violently, as though it were trying to tear itself apart. The light from the box swirled around them, and in that moment, Emily understood. The box wasn't just a container, it was a prison. A prison for whatever dark force had been unleashed when Marlowe first found it. And Marlowe had broken the seal. He had awakened the song, and now the song was claiming him. The rift pulsed again, its edges beginning to warp, the ground beneath them cracking, as if the very earth were being pulled apart. The creatures, born from the song, were closing in again, but now, something else was happening. The box was pulling back. "You can't," Marlowe roared, his voice now frantic, almost desperate. "It's mine. I made it mine." But the box didn't listen. A sudden, crushing force filled the room, and the light from the box expanded, forcing back the rift's influence. The creatures shrieked, their forms dissolving in the light, and Marlowe, too, screamed as the light surrounded him, engulfing him in its blinding radiance. In that moment, Emily knew what she had to do. "Ethan," she cried, turning to him. "The box, destroy it, now!" He nodded, the journal still clutched in his hands. With a grim expression, he hurled the journal toward the pedestal, where it was swallowed by the light. The box trembled as if reacting to the journal's presence, the symbols flaring brighter than ever. Without waiting, Emily moved toward the pedestal, her heart pounding in her chest. The box's pulsing glow seemed to respond to her approach, and though she felt the raw power of it deep within her, she knew this was the only way. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her hands to the surface of the box. The instant she made contact, the world around her shattered. The song grew louder. The air grew thick with the sound of hundreds of voices, screaming, begging for release. It felt as though the walls themselves were screaming at her, the pressure building to unbearable levels. The rift was pulling her in, trying to consume her. But Emily focused. The symbols on the box flashed one last time, and with a final push, Emily whispered the last incantation from the journal. She wasn't sure if it was enough, but she had no choice. She felt the pulse of the song beginning to slow, the vibrations weakening. The pull of the rift lessened, and then, with a deafening crack, the box shattered. When the box shattered, the entire rift seemed to collapse in on itself. The sound that filled the room was not just a noise, but a force, a deafening crash, like the breaking of 1,000 glass panes all at once. The blinding light from the box flared and exploded outward, engulfing everything in its path. Emily was thrown backward, her body tumbling through the air like a rag doll, and the world around her seemed to dissolve into pure white light. And then nothing. For a long moment, there was no sound, no sensation. It was as if the universe itself had stopped, frozen in time. Emily blinked rapidly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that slowly began to creep back into the world. Her head throbbed, and her limbs felt heavy. She was lying on cold stone, her body aching from the impact. With great effort, she pushed herself up, gasping for air. The rift, the song, had vanished. The twisted, warping darkness was gone, and the haunting melody that had driven them to the brink of insanity had fallen silent. "Ethan," she called, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. There was no response at first, and her heart skipped a beat. Had it worked? Had they really stopped it? "Ethan," she shouted again, scrambling to her feet, her legs wobbling beneath her as she stumbled forward. Her eyes scanned the room. The crumbling walls of the building had stopped shifting, and the shadows seemed to have receded, though the oppressive atmosphere remained. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then she saw him. Ethan was standing near the center of the room, looking disoriented but unharmed. His eyes met hers, and a flicker of recognition passed between them. He was alive. He was okay. For a moment, Emily felt a surge of relief. They had done it. They had stopped Marlowe and the song. But then, as Ethan stepped closer, she saw it. His eyes were different. They were darker than before, the familiar warmth replaced by something cold, empty. A hollow void stared back at her from beneath his brow, as if something had shifted inside him. "Ethan," she asked, her voice trembling with concern. Are you all right?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, staring at her, his expression unreadable. The moment stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And then, without warning, he lunged. Emily barely had time to react as Ethan's hand shot out toward her. His grip tightened around her wrists, his fingers digging into her skin with unnatural strength. His face was contorted, twisted with a mix of rage and sorrow. And for a brief moment, Emily saw the person he had been, the person she had fought alongside. But it was gone. In its place was something darker, something that wasn't entirely human. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "You should have never tried to stop me," he whispered, his voice low and strained, filled with something alien. "You think you understand? You don't. The song. It's in me now. I can feel it. It's here." His fingers tightened, squeezing with more force than she thought he could exert. His eyes bore into hers with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "No," Emily whispered, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Ethan, don't. This isn't you." For a second, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a fleeting moment of his old self. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that hollow darkness. The rift was not truly closed. The song had found a way to take root in him, to twist him into something else. And then she understood. The destruction of the box had not erased the song. It had merely fragmented it, scattering its influence throughout the world. Marlowe's transformation had been only the beginning. The song, the force that had created it, was far more insidious than they could have ever imagined. It had found another vessel. "Ethan," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You have to fight it. Please. I need you to fight it." He shook his head slowly, a dark grin forming on his lips. "I don't want to fight it, Emily. I can feel it, this power, this hunger." His grip loosened slightly, and his hands began to tremble as if the power inside him was threatening to tear him apart. But his smile never wavered. "I've become something more, something beyond what you can understand." "Ethan, listen to me," she cried, her eyes welling with tears. "We can still fix this. We can still stop it together." But there was no answer. Instead, Ethan stepped back, his hands still shaking, his body jerking as though something unseen were struggling to control him. And then the riff's song began again, soft at first, a haunting whisper that pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. It filled the room, rising with intensity, reverberating deep within Emily's chest. It wasn't over. It wasn't over at all. Ethan turned away from her, his back to her, as he began to walk toward the center of the room. "I've seen the truth, Emily," he murmured, his voice growing distant. "The song is more than just power. It's a door, and I'm the key. Nothing can stop it now." Before she could move, before she could stop him, Ethan raised his hand toward the floor. The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a glowing symbol that pulsed with dark energy. The rift wasn't fully closed. It was merely hidden, waiting for the right moment to reappear. And as Emily's heart sank, she realized the truth. Ethan was no longer just a man. He was a conduit, a vessel for the song's power. And it was only a matter of time before he would be consumed completely by it. He turned his face toward her, and in his eyes, there was only emptiness. "Goodbye, Emily," he whispered, his voice tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. Before she could respond, before she could even reach him, the rift erupted once again, this time with a force so powerful that the entire building seemed to tremble. The song blared louder, more insistent, and the world around her began to warp once again. Ethan had become part of it, and their battle was far from over. The world around Emily spun as the rift erupted with unimaginable force. The building trembled violently, its foundations groaning under the pressure of the dark energy. The walls cracked, and the air grew thick with the presence of the song, its pulse reverberating through her body like a second heartbeat. Every inch of the space around her seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality were beginning to tear apart. Ethan stood at the center of the chaos, his body glowing with a dark energy that was not entirely his own. The rift symbols seemed to rise up around him, swirling in the air like a storm, as though they were responding to his very presence. The ground beneath his feet cracked further, the glowing symbols bleeding into the earth, creating a lattice of dark energy that stretched outward, seeking to spread. "No!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. She rushed toward him, but the power of the rift, of the song, was like a wall between them. The energy in the air pulled at her, dragging her backwards with each step she took. It was as though the rift itself were fighting to keep her away. Ethan's head turned slowly, his eyes black voids, his once familiar face twisted with an expression of profound emptiness. There was no sign of the person she had known, no trace of the man who had fought beside her against Marlowe. The Ethan she had loved was gone, replaced by something darker, more powerful, and beyond her reach. "You shouldn't have tried to stop me, Emily," he whispered, his voice distorted, hollow. It was as if the song had swallowed every part of him, leaving only echoes of what was once human. "I told you, I'm beyond this now, beyond all of it." The air thickened with each word he spoke. His presence seemed to distort the space around them, the walls bending and stretching, the shadows in the room flickering as if they had come to life. "Ethan, please," Emily begged, her hands trembling as she stretched them out toward him. "You don't have to do this. We can fight this together. I can help you." But Ethan didn't move. His expression remained unchanged, that hollow void of emptiness locked on her. For a moment, a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something like recognition, a flicker of the man he had been. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the song that had consumed him. "No," he said softly. "You're wrong. You never understood. This isn't just power. This is the truth. The song is the key, and I am the one who holds it." Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt, as though the very laws of reality were bending under the weight of his words. The rift pulsed again, and the floor split beneath Emily's feet. She staggered, struggling to keep her balance as the walls seemed to shift, the space around her warping and expanding, becoming something alien. The rift had grown. It was no longer just a crack in reality. It was a tear, a gateway, and Ethan was its doorway. "Ethan, no!" Emily cried out, reaching toward him once more, her heart breaking as she saw the complete transformation that had taken place. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was the vessel. He had become the rift. The light around him grew brighter, blinding her for a moment, before it all seemed to shift. The world around her began to blur, the lines of reality dissolving. The room was no longer a room. It was a space between worlds, a place where time and space no longer had meaning. And then, just as quickly, the light snapped out of existence, leaving Emily standing in an empty void. She gasped for breath, her body feeling heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The rift was gone, but so was the building. There was no longer any physical space around her. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the distant, haunting song echoed, faint but still present. Ethan was gone. The building was gone. Everything she had fought for, everything she had worked to protect, was gone. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Emily's eyes narrowed as she searched the void around her. She had no idea where she was, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end. The rift had not closed. It had only shifted. The song was still alive, still breathing, and Ethan was at the center of it. Her mind raced as she pieced together the truth. The box, the rift, the song, they weren't just connected. They were bound together, and by destroying the box, she had unknowingly freed the force that Marlowe had tried to control, a force that now sought to rip apart the very fabric of reality. Ethan had become the conduit. He had become the door through which the song would spread, and the world would collapse under its weight. But Emily wasn't done fighting. She wasn't going to give up on him. With her heart pounding, she focused on the faint hum in the distance, the song that still echoed through the void. It was faint, like a whisper in the dark, but it was there. The rift was still open, and as long as it existed, Ethan was not truly lost. "I will save you, Ethan," she whispered to the darkness around her, her voice steady despite the fear that still clung to her. "I promise you." She didn't know how, didn't know what it would take, but she was going to find a way to pull him back, to bring him back from the edge. The darkness around her began to shift. The edges of the void seemed to bend, rippling like water, and the song grew louder, more insistent. There were no walls here, no boundaries. She was lost in the nothingness, but she could feel the rift pulling at her. And then she saw it, a flicker in the darkness, a shape in the distance. It was Ethan. His silhouette was shrouded in darkness, his body still emanating the eerie glow that had consumed him. But this time there was something else. He was moving toward her. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward him, the song growing louder with each step. The distance between them seemed to stretch endlessly, but her determination was stronger than ever. "Ethan," she cried, reaching out for him. "Please fight this. It's not too late." His form grew clearer as she neared, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He wasn't the man she had known. He was something else now. "Ethan," she cried again, her voice breaking. "I need you." He stopped, his eyes locking with hers. And for a brief moment, just a brief moment, she saw it. A flicker of the man he had been, buried beneath the darkness. A hint of the love they had shared, the connection that had once bound them. But then the darkness surged, and Ethan was gone. The rift pulsed with a deafening roar, and everything around her began to collapse. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she plunged forward, her feet barely touching the shifting ground beneath her. The void around her seemed to close in, the riff's song growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just an echo anymore, it was a pulsing rhythm, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something that had always existed, waiting for the right moment to break free. The darkness pressed against her skin, clung to her body, but she didn't care. There was only one thing that mattered now. Only one person. Ethan. She could feel him ahead, the faint glow of his presence pulling her forward. Each step she took was heavy, as though the rift itself was trying to hold her back. The ground trembled underfoot, and the shadows stretched and flickered like living creatures, but Emily was determined. "Ethan," she called out again, her voice carrying through the void. "Please listen to me. You're not lost. We can fix this." But her words were swallowed by the song, lost in the cacophony that surrounded her. The rift was alive, feeding on her fear, amplifying the terror that clawed at her chest. It was as if the song itself was mocking her, feeding off her desperation, growing stronger with every step she took. She couldn't stop now. Emily pushed forward, her legs burning with the effort, the world around her warping with each step. The space seemed to stretch and fold in on itself, like a maze with no exit. There were no landmarks, no sense of direction, just the constant pull of the rift, the relentless beat of the song. And then she saw him. Ethan was standing in the center of a swirling vortex of darkness, his form glowing with an otherworldly light. He looked different. His body was unnaturally still, as though he were caught between worlds. The edges of his being flickered and shifted, as if his very essence was being torn apart. His eyes locked onto hers, but there was nothing in them. No recognition, no emotion, just the cold, hollow void of the song's influence. "Ethan," Emily whispered, her voice breaking as she reached for him. But he didn't move. The rift pulsed again, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open, the blackness widening as if to swallow her whole. The song's rhythm grew faster, more frantic, as though it were reaching a crescendo. And then something shifted. Ethan's form flickered again, and for a brief moment his eyes cleared. The darkness lifted just enough for Emily to see the man he had been, the man she had loved. He blinked, his face softening as though he recognized her, as though he could hear her voice. Emily. His voice was a broken whisper, distorted and weak. It was as if the song had drained him of everything, leaving behind only fragments of the person he had been. "I'm sorry." Emily's heart ached at the sound of his voice. "Ethan, no. You don't have to be sorry. We can still fix this. We can still get out of here. Together." But the rift pulsed again, louder this time, and Ethan's form began to twist once more. The darkness surrounded him, and the glow of the rift consumed him. "No, Emily." His voice was barely audible now, as though it were being swallowed by the song. "I can't stop it. It's too strong. It's too..." His body jerked, and his head snapped back as if something was forcing him into submission. The light that had briefly illuminated his form flickered out, leaving him a silhouette in the midst of the void. "Ethan!" Emily screamed, reaching for him, but she was too far away. The rift had created a barrier between them, a wall of darkness, of pure malevolent energy. The song swelled, the sound deafening now. It was no longer just a melody. It was a force, a living thing that pulsed with a terrifying hunger. "I'm sorry, Emily." Ethan's voice came again, barely a whisper. His face was now contorted with pain, his body racked with spasms. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she watched him struggle. She knew, deep down, that there was no turning back for him. The song had taken him, and there was nothing left of the man she had known. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. With a cry of anguish, Emily reached deep within herself, searching for something, anything, that could save him. She had learned too much to let this end in failure. The song, the riff, the box, all of it, it was connected. She had destroyed the box, but the song had not been erased. It had been fragmented, dispersed, and now it was consuming Ethan. but maybe, just maybe, she could reverse it. The rift pulsed again, and she felt it, the pull of the song's power, trying to drag her in, trying to tear her apart. She had to fight it, she had to resist. "I won't lose you, Ethan," she cried, her voice fierce now. "I'll fight this. I'll fight for you." She closed her eyes, reaching deep into the memory of the journal, the incantations, the symbols, the rituals. There was a way. There had to be a way to seal the rift again, to stop the song once and for all. She began to chant the words she remembered, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each syllable. The air around her seemed to thicken, the darkness pushing back, the rift's energy resisting her efforts. But Emily didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. She felt the power of the song growing weaker, felt the pull of Ethan's presence, his soul, fighting against the rift, fighting to break free. And then, in the distance, she saw something faint, barely visible, a flicker of light. Ethan, his body was trembling, but the darkness was lifting from him, the influence of the rift beginning to fade. "Ethan," Emily shouted, her voice filled with hope. "It's working. You're coming back." But just as she thought she was reaching him, the song surged once more, stronger than ever, slamming into her like a physical force. The air around her crackled with dark energy, and the rift began to close, but not in the way she had hoped. No! The song was not done with her. The rift was collapsing, but Ethan was still trapped. The pull of the song was dragging her toward him, forcing her to make a choice. Would she sacrifice herself to save him? The air crackled around Emily, and the darkness grew more intense. It was as if the very fabric of reality was breaking, the rift collapsing in on itself. Ethan was still there, a flickering, trembling shadow, caught between worlds, trapped in the rift's grip. She could feel the pull of the rift, its power, its hunger. It was like a claw around her chest, squeezing tighter with every second. Her heart pounded in her ears, and every instinct told her to run, to escape, to leave this nightmare behind. But Ethan was here, and he needed her. She couldn't abandon him. She couldn't let him slip away, not after everything they'd been through. The rift's energy grew louder, the song growing into an all-encompassing roar. It was no longer a melody. It was a storm, a tempest, a force of nature that was trying to swallow her whole. Her vision blurred as the sound drowned out everything else. But through the chaos, she still saw Ethan, struggling to break free, his body racked with spasms as the rift's power consumed him. "Ethan," she screamed, her voice hoarse from the strain. "You can fight this. You're still in there." But her words were lost in the roar of the song. The darkness around her swirled like a vortex, pulling at her every step. It felt as though she were being sucked into the very heart of the rift, her feet dragging as if the ground had turned to quicksand. And yet she fought. She fought with every ounce of strength she had left. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking, "don't give up on me." Ethan's eyes flickered again, a brief moment of clarity piercing through the darkness. She saw it, saw him, the man she had loved, the man who had fought by her side. But it was fleeting, and the moment was crushed by the overwhelming power of the rift. "I can't." His voice was barely audible now, lost beneath the overwhelming roar of the song. "I'm too far gone, Emily." "No." She refused to believe it. She couldn't. She wouldn't. With every bit of willpower she could muster, Emily took a step forward, ignoring the pulling weight of the rift. She reached out her hand toward Ethan, the light from her body flickering as the energy of the rift attempted to tear her apart. Her fingers brushed the darkness, and she felt it, a jolt of raw energy that burned her skin, searing her with the power of the rift. But she didn't let go. "I won't let you go," she thought fiercely. "I can't." The ground shook violently as the rift began to collapse faster, the pull of the song tightening around them both. The blackness was pressing in from every side, and Emily felt herself being dragged closer and closer to the heart of the rift. She looked into Ethan's eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, and saw the flicker again. A glimpse of something human, something that was him. It was enough. It had to be enough. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that churned in her chest. "We can fix this. I won't leave you." Ethan's form flickered again, and this time, the energy around him surged with an intensity that knocked her back. The world around them distorted, the riff's song reaching a crescendo. She could feel it now, the weight of the riff's power closing in. It was too much. It was too strong. There was no way she could hold on forever. And then, the rift did something unexpected. The pull, the grip of its power, loosened. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the chaos stopping just long enough for Emily to take a breath. She looked at Ethan, saw the conflict in his eyes, and knew what she had to do. The only way to save him now was to sever the connection, to break the rift and stop the song. But it would come at a cost. Her heart thundered in her chest as she made her decision. She wasn't going to let the song win. She wasn't going to lose Ethan to this thing that had claimed him. She closed her eyes and focused on the riff's energy, on the song, on the darkness that surrounded them both. She could feel it now, the raw power of it all, the very core of the riff that had consumed Ethan, consumed everything around her. The incantations she had read in Marlowe's journals, she now knew what they truly meant. The rift wasn't just a force of darkness. It was a force of balance, and if it had consumed Ethan, it would consume her too, unless she could sever the tie between them, separate them from the song's influence. But there was no going back. The energy she was about to unleash would destroy both the rift and everything connected to it, including herself. Her hands trembled as she formed the final gesture, the symbol of the ritual. She spoke the words she had memorized, the chant rising in her chest like an unstoppable force. "No!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. "Don't do it!" But Emily couldn't stop. It was too late. The power was already coursing through her. The rift pulsed violently, the air around them snapping with raw energy. She felt herself slipping, losing her grip on reality. The song, the rift, it was all becoming a blur of blackness, and she could feel herself being pulled into it, her soul on the edge of being consumed. She felt Ethan's presence beside her, the faintest whisper of his touch. And then, silence. The rift collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar, the song falling silent. The world around her went dark. The silence was deafening. The roaring song, the crackling rift, the storm of chaos, all of it had ceased. The world around Emily felt impossibly still, as if time itself had frozen. Her body felt numb, every inch of her being heavy and detached, as though she were floating in a vast emptiness. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was still alive. She blinked her eyes open, but the world around her was dark, the edges of reality indistinct. There was no longer a void or a rift, just a weightless, blank space. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet, couldn't hear anything, not even her own breath. "Ethan?" Her voice came out weak, strained. The effort to speak felt like dragging her soul through a thick fog. She tried to move, but her limbs were sluggish, as though her body had been emptied of strength. Did it work? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. She felt an odd sense of detachment, as though she were both here and not here, caught between worlds. The darkness was complete, but there was something faint, a spark of warmth. She reached out instinctively, her fingers trembling as they brushed against something. A presence. "Ethan?" she called again, this time with more urgency. The presence shifted. A familiar warmth filled the space around her, a whisper of something she could recognize him. Her heart skipped, and she pushed herself to her feet, forcing the sluggishness from her limbs. She didn't know where she was or how to move through this strange limbo, but she had to find him. She couldn't lose him now. Her breath caught in her throat as the warmth grew closer. She focused, zeroing in on it, and slowly, gradually, her surroundings began to come into focus. The world was returning, albeit in pieces, as though the rift had fractured reality itself. Then she saw him. Ethan stood before her, his form hazy and indistinct, like a shadow half formed in the light. His eyes were dark, filled with confusion and pain, but he was there. Alive. Ethan, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. She took a step toward him, then another, her legs shaky. I thought I lost you. His figure flickered, then solidified just enough for her to see him clearly. The edges of his body were still translucent, but the familiar outline of his face, his smile, that haunted, loving expression began to materialize. Emily. His voice was hoarse, strained, but there was something in it, something that made her heart swell. What? What happened? I can't remember. She rushed to him, her heart in her throat. You were lost, she said softly, reaching out and touching his arm. The rift. It took you, but I brought you back. I had to. I couldn't leave you in there. He blinked, as if he were still processing, still grappling with the memory of what had happened. The shadows around him shifted uneasily, as though they weren't fully gone, as though they were still clinging to him. I don't understand, Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It's all so blurry. Don't worry, Emily said quickly, trying to reassure him. You're here now. That's all that matters. You're safe. But even as she spoke the words, she felt a deep, unsettling unease. The rift had collapsed. She had severed the connection. But Ethan, he didn't seem the same. There was something off about him, something that didn't sit right in her gut. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes still unfocused. He looked around them, as though he couldn't recognize the space they were in. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. It was as though they were trapped in a world that didn't quite belong to either of them. I don't feel like myself, Ethan admitted, his voice quiet, uncertain. He looked at his hands as though seeing them for the first time, then up at Emily with a haunted expression. It's like there's something still inside me, something I can't get rid of. Emily's heart sank. The rift, she said softly. It changed you. But you can fight this, Ethan. You have to. He shook his head, his eyes flashing with something darker, something more distant. I don't know if I can, Emily. I don't know if I can ever be the same again. She felt her throat tighten as she stared at him, the horror of what had happened slowly creeping back. She had saved him from the rift, but the cost of their actions was still present. Ethan had been altered, changed. The shadows around him flickered again, and for a moment, she saw it, just a flash. The familiar glow in his eyes was gone, replaced by the same void that had consumed him before. It was like a shadow creeping over him again, threatening to take him back. No, Emily whispered, taking a step back. She gripped his shoulders, shaking him gently. No, Ethan, don't go back. Please, we can fix this. But his expression was distant, lost. The darkness was beginning to seep into his features once again, as though it had never truly left him. The power of the rift, the song, it wasn't just something external. It was part of him now, and Emily realized, with a cold clarity, that the rift had changed Ethan in ways she hadn't fully understood. It had twisted him, had made him a part of the darkness that had sought to consume them both. The rift was no longer just a place. It was an essence, a power that could never truly be destroyed. And it had left its mark on Ethan. No, she muttered to herself, her pulse quickening. I won't let you go. Not again. Ethan's eyes seemed to cloud over once more, and the cold, hollow look returned to them. The rift's power was taking hold again, consuming him, pulling him back into the darkness. I'm sorry, Emily, he said, his voice empty now. The light in his eyes had completely dimmed. But I'm not who you think I am anymore. Emily staggered back, her breath coming in short gasps. Ethan, please. And just like that, he was gone. The figure of Ethan before her flickered and vanished, as though he had never been there at all. The silence returned, deeper this time, heavier. Emily was left alone in the void, the crushing weight of her failure settling on her shoulders. She had brought him back, but in doing so, had she only unleashed something worse? She didn't know how long she stood there, trying to catch her breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. The rift had collapsed, but its mark remained, its power lingering in the very fabric of the world. And she had been a part of it. She had let it consume her, and now it had consumed Ethan. I have to fix this, Emily said to the darkness. I have to, but deep down, She knew that whatever was left of Ethan was slipping away, and the true horror was just beginning. The emptiness around her stretched on endlessly. The moment Ethan had disappeared, the world seemed to collapse once again, like a house of cards folding in on itself. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tight with a crushing weight. She stood alone in the dark void where reality had once existed, the echo of Ethan's fading presence still lingering in the air. She had failed. Her heart raced as the thoughts stormed through her mind, each one more chaotic than the last. What happened? What have I done? She had tried so hard to save him, to pull him from the rift, but now she was left with the horrible realization that the rift had never truly left him. It had twisted something inside him, something that had been buried beneath the surface, and now it was consuming him once more. "Ethan," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the silence, swallowed up by the void around her. She had seen it in his eyes, the darkness, the hollow emptiness. The rift had marked him, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase that mark. Her hands shook as she clasped them together, pressing them against her chest as though she could hold her heart inside. She had to fix this. She had to find him, bring him back before it was too late. But she didn't even know where to begin. She had thought the rift was gone, that the darkness had been banished with its collapse. But it hadn't been. It was still there, still inside Ethan, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. She stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the ground that wasn't really there, and collapsed against the wall of nothingness that surrounded her. The wall seemed to pulse with the faintest light, just enough to illuminate her thoughts, chaotic, disordered thoughts. "Think, Emily. Think." Her mind raced, grasping for any shred of clarity, but all she found was confusion. She couldn't even trust the memory of what had happened, the journal entries that had led her here, the rituals she had performed. The rift had distorted everything. Had she truly severed the connection? Had she done enough to destroy it? But what if there was more? What if the rift had been more than just an entity? What if it had been a part of something larger, a force that she couldn't fully comprehend? What if Ethan had never been fully whole, and now the rift was just exploiting his weaknesses? Her breath caught as another thought hit her. What if this was always meant to happen? She shuddered at the possibility. But then, from the depths of her mind, another memory surfaced, the part of the journal she had skipped over, the one she hadn't fully understood. "There's always a price," the words had read. "A force once unleashed can never truly be sealed. It seeks what it craves, and if the soul is weakened, it will find a way." She gasped. Ethan's soul. The rift had consumed him, but it hadn't fully taken him. It had only changed him, had left an imprint on his very being. The price hadn't been fully paid, and now it was going to claim him entirely. Emily's eyes snapped open, the realization hitting her like a lightning bolt. I can't fix him, not the way I thought I could, not with rituals or spells. I need to go deeper. I need to get to the heart of it, to the soul of the rift itself. She stood, the overwhelming weight of her new understanding crashing over her. If she wanted to truly save Ethan, if there was still any chance of pulling him back from the edge, she would have to go into the rift itself, into the heart of it. "Ethan, I'm coming for you," she whispered, determination settling in her chest like a fire. "I don't care what it takes. I'll get you back. I won't leave you." She wasn't sure how she knew, but she could feel it. She knew where she needed to go. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes, focusing on the presence she had felt earlier. The faint connection, the warmth. It was a tether, fragile but present, and it was all she had left to hold on to. The darkness began to shift around her, swirling, folding inward, as if it had been waiting for her to make her move. The air grew thick with a strange, oppressive weight, and the world started to warp again. The ground beneath her feet seemed to unravel, pulling her forward as though the void itself was reaching out to take her. She gripped the air in front of her, and with a final, desperate push, she leapt into the abyss. When Emily opened her eyes again, the world around her was different. She stood in the center of an enormous chamber, the walls slick and black, as if they had been carved from obsidian. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, and something darker, something older. A vast, swirling vortex of darkness hung in the center of the room, its edges pulsating with a sickly light. It seemed to be alive, breathing, shifting as though it were an enormous eye watching her every move. It was the rift's heart, the source of all the power, all the darkness that had claimed Ethan. In the distance, she saw him. Ethan was standing in the center of the swirling vortex, his body hunched over, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked broken. The faint glow she had seen earlier was gone, replaced with a hollow darkness. His eyes were black, devoid of the man she had known. "Ethan," she cried, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. His head snapped up, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Just a moment, but then it was gone, replaced by the same empty darkness. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice a low growl, unnatural. The rift's influence was heavy in his words, a force pulling at him. "There's nothing left of me. It's too late." "No!" Emily shouted, stepping forward. "You're still in there. I know you are. I can feel it. Fight it, Ethan." But his form wavered, distorted as the rift fed on him. The more she moved toward him, the further away he seemed to get. "I can't," he whispered, his voice fading, like a distant memory. "The rift has already taken everything from me. You can't save me." "I won't give up," Emily cried, reaching out for him. But as her hand touched the darkness, a surge of energy exploded from the vortex. It slammed into her, sending her crashing backward. Her body slammed against the ground with an unforgiving force, the world spinning around her. She groaned, struggling to rise, but the pull of the rift was too strong. She could feel it tugging at her soul, trying to draw her into the heart of it, to consume her just as it had done to Ethan. She couldn't give in. She wouldn't. For the first time, she realized something deeper. This wasn't just about saving Ethan anymore. It was about stopping the rift before it consumed everything, before it tore through the fabric of their reality. If she didn't find a way to destroy it now, it would never stop. This is the final choice, Emily thought. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything on her shoulders. But she wasn't alone. Not entirely. Ethan was still there, a faint flicker beneath the surface, fighting the darkness, even now. And that, Emily knew, was her only hope. The chamber was alive with the pulse of the rift, its darkness seeping into Emily's bones, its presence pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel it like a weight on her chest, like a force trying to break her apart, piece by piece. But she didn't let it break her. Not this time. She rose shakily to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion and the sheer power of the rift trying to overwhelm her. Her hands were still sore from the last blast of energy, but she ignored it, pushing herself forward with all the strength she had left. There was no going back now. Ethan was still out there, somewhere in the swirling black mass, and she couldn't let him slip away again. As she moved toward him, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the air thickening around her, growing colder with each step. The vortex in the center of the room loomed larger, its blackness pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. And Ethan. He was still standing there, right in the center of the storm, but he was no longer moving. His body was hunched, as though he were in pain, and the darkness around him seemed to be feeding on his suffering. "Ethan!" Emily cried out again, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Please! I'm here! Don't give up!" For a moment, his eyes flickered, and for the briefest second, Emily thought she saw the man she loved looking back at her. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that deep, unyielding darkness. "You don't understand." Ethan's voice came, distorted and hollow, as if it was being pulled away from him. I don't know how to fight this anymore, Emily. The rift, it's a part of me now. I can't outrun it. I can't hide from it. You're still in there?" Emily shouted, stepping closer. "I know you are. I know you're not gone. Ethan, please. Fight it. Fight for us." Ethan's form trembled, and she saw a flicker of emotion pass through him, a moment of weakness, a crack in the wall the rift had built around him. But then the darkness surged, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching his head as if he were fighting something inside of him. I can't. It's too strong, Ethan whispered. I'm losing myself. I can't control it. Emily's heart ached as she saw him there, torn apart by the force of the rift. The darkness had taken root in him so deeply that it seemed to be entwined with his very soul. She couldn't let him go. Not like this. She fell to her knees beside him, gripping his shoulders, desperate. You can fight it, Ethan. You have to. I won't let this darkness take you. Please. But his eyes, those once vibrant eyes that had been filled with love, were now empty. He looked at her, really looked at her, but there was nothing in his gaze. Nothing but the cold, hollow emptiness of the rift. You can't save me, Emily, he said softly. It's too late for me. But you can still save yourself. You can still stop this. You're stronger than me. You have to stop the rift. You have to end it before it takes everything. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had come here to save him, to pull him back from the abyss. But now he was telling her to stop the rift, to destroy it, to end the very force that had nearly consumed them both. I can't do this without you, she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyes softened for a moment, and she saw a flicker of the man she had loved. But just as quickly it was gone. You're not alone, Emily, he said, his voice hoarse. You never were. And with those words, a deep rumble shook the chamber. The rift pulsed once more, its power flaring violently, and the very fabric of the room seemed to shift. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the air grew thick with the pull of the rift, as though it were trying to swallow them whole. No, Emily cried, trying to hold on to him. We can stop this. We can still fix this. But the rift was growing stronger, feeding on the very despair that clung to them. Ethan's body trembled, his form flickering in and out of existence. He was being consumed from the inside out, and Emily could do nothing but watch as the man she loved was swallowed by the darkness. The chamber began to collapse. The walls splintered, the ground cracked, and the black vortex at the center of the room began to spiral violently, drawing in everything around it. Emily's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The rift wasn't just consuming Ethan, it was about to consume everything. The entire reality was unraveling. The rift was spreading, growing, and there was only one way to stop it. She looked at Ethan one last time, her hand gently touching his face, as though trying to anchor him to her, to remind him of the love they had shared. But his eyes were already lost to the void. The darkness had taken him completely. I'm sorry, she whispered, her tears falling freely. I love you. And with that, she made her choice. She pushed herself to her feet, stepping away from Ethan's broken form. The rift was pulling at her, trying to claim her as it had claimed him, but she resisted. She had to end it. She had to end it all, no matter the cost. With a final, desperate breath, she ran toward the center of the vortex. The darkness tried to wrap around her, to stop her, but she was no longer afraid. She had come this far. There was no turning back. This is the end, she thought. She reached the heart of the rift, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she raised her hands. She could feel the rift's power crackling beneath her fingertips, pulling at her, feeding on her energy. But she held firm, focusing on the one thing that remained in her heart, the love she had for Ethan. No more, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. No more. And with that, she let go. The rift let out a deafening roar as the darkness exploded outward, a wave of pure energy that shattered the very foundation of the chamber. The walls crumbled, the air tore apart, and the ground shattered beneath her feet. For a moment, everything went dark. When Emily opened her eyes again, the world was silent. The rift was gone. The darkness was gone. She could feel it in the air. The weight had lifted. The oppressive force that had haunted her for so long was no longer there. The world was still, but there was a heaviness in her chest, a deep emptiness. She pushed herself up, looking around. She was no longer in the chamber of the rift. Instead, she found herself standing in a field, bathed in the soft glow of a new dawn. The sky was a pale blue, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting its golden light across the landscape. The world was peaceful, but Ethan was still gone. Her heart ached with the loss. The rift had claimed him. There was no going back. She had made the choice to end the darkness, to save what was left of the world. But the price had been too high. As she stood there, staring at the horizon, she knew this was just the beginning. The rift had been destroyed, but its legacy, the darkness it had left in her soul, in the world, would linger forever. But Emily also knew one thing for sure. She would carry Ethan's memory with her, always. She would live for both of them. She would honor him, and if she ever had to face darkness again, she would be ready. For now, though, the battle was over, and the dawn had come. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the field where Emily stood, her eyes lost in the horizon. The weight of what she had done settled into her bones, as real and undeniable as the ground beneath her feet. Ethan's absence was an ache that she couldn't ignore. His face, his voice, the warmth of his presence. Everything about him was a memory now, a fragile and painful thing she would carry with her forever. But the world had been saved, hadn't it? The rift was gone. The darkness was no longer threatening to consume everything. The sky was clear, the land untouched by the chaos that had gripped it for so long. The world was whole again. Yet, there was a gnawing emptiness inside her, something that lingered despite the peaceful surroundings. She could feel it, a stirring in the pit of her stomach, a quiet whisper just beneath her thoughts. The rift was gone, but something remained. Something wrong. The breeze rustled the grass around her, the only sound breaking the silence. But it wasn't enough to shake her unease. She turned her eyes toward the distant horizon again, as if expecting to see something, someone, anything that would break the stillness. But there was nothing. It's over, she told herself. The rift is gone. Ethan is gone. There's nothing left to do. Still, something inside her refused to let go of the unease. The world was quiet now, but she knew better than to trust appearances. The rift had been a force of nature, something powerful, something ancient, and though it had been destroyed, its very nature would not vanish so easily. And then there was Emily herself, changed, marked by everything that had happened. The darkness that had once consumed Ethan hadn't just disappeared. It had touched her, too. She could still feel its residue, like an echo deep inside her. Something that wouldn't wash away so easily. As she walked through the field, her mind returned to the journal, the cryptic entries she had ignored, the warnings she hadn't fully understood. What had been left unsaid? What had been buried, hidden beneath the pages? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flicker of something in the distance. A movement, subtle at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. A figure, standing still, watching her from the edge of the field. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. But the closer Emily got, the clearer it became that this wasn't a trick of the mind. It was real. When she was only a few yards away, she saw him more clearly. A man. His figure was familiar, yet wrong. His posture rigid, his expression unreadable. There was something off about him. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. She stopped short, studying him carefully. His features were pale, almost ghostly, and there was an eerie stillness about him. But it was his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes that sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't Ethan. It couldn't be. Yet it was something close, something like him. The darkness that had claimed Ethan had left behind a mark, but this was something different. This was not the Ethan she had known. This was something reborn from the shadows of the rift. "I'm sorry." The man's voice broke the silence, but it wasn't Ethan's voice. It was distorted, fragmented, as though it was struggling to form something coherent. "But you shouldn't have destroyed it." The air around them seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy, and the ground trembled beneath Emily's feet. A deep rumble echoed from the earth, and she took an instinctive step back. You're not him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The figure tilted its head, and Emily felt a cold, sickening realization creep up her spine. It was as if the rift had survived after all. But instead of finding a way back into the world, it had somehow manifested here through him. "This world is not free," the figure said, its voice growing louder, more commanding. "You can never destroy what lives in the shadows. It always finds a way." The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and black tendrils of energy began to coil up from the earth. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and Emily realized that this wasn't just a man. It wasn't even Ethan anymore. It was the rift, reaching into her world again, finding a new way to continue its existence. "No," Emily breathed. "I destroyed it. You should be gone. This isn't possible." The figure didn't respond in words, but its eyes, those hollow, pitch-black eyes, narrowed in what might have been recognition. As the dark energy spread outward, Emily stumbled backward, her legs shaking. This force, it wasn't just lingering. It was taking form, reshaping itself, bringing the rift's influence back into the world. She had thought she'd destroyed it. She had thought she'd saved him. But this wasn't over. The rift had never truly been severed. It had only been dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before Emily could react, the figure raised one hand, and the black tendrils shot forward, wrapping around her, constricting her body with terrifying strength. The world around her seemed to blur as the darkness pressed in from all sides. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled, but the energy held her tight. "You can't stop it, Emily," the figure's voice echoed in her mind, growing louder, as though the rift itself was speaking through him. "The rift has already taken root again. It will consume you. It will consume everything." Terror gripped her heart as she realized the magnitude of what she had done. The rift hadn't just disappeared. It had found another way to survive. And now it was going to finish what it had started. The world would fall into darkness once again. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, some way to fight this, to stop the rift from claiming everything. And then it hit her. The rift had been inside Ethan, and it had been inside her, too, lingering after the destruction of the chamber. She had absorbed its darkness, but she hadn't understood it. But she could. The energy, the darkness, it had a source, a pulse. If she could learn to control it, to focus it. Suddenly, she reached out with her mind, touching the power that held her, feeling its pulse, its rhythm. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, centering herself. She could feel the rift, its ancient energy, the way it resonated with everything she was. It wasn't just a force of destruction. It was a force of creation, too. And in that moment, Emily knew what she had to do. She let go. The power that had been constricting her began to unravel, the tendrils loosening as her own will surged against it. The darkness tried to push back, but she was stronger now. She had learned, understood what the rift truly was, and she was going to use that knowledge to destroy it once and for all. With one final surge, Emily shattered the darkness that bound her. The ground cracked. The figure howled in rage as the rift's energy collapsed around them. The figure crumbled, its form flickering like a shadow before vanishing into nothingness. Emily stood there, breathless, her body trembling as the last remnants of the rift's power disintegrated around her. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in the distance, she saw the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. The battle was over, but Emily knew this. The rift might be gone for now, but its influence would never truly leave her. The air was still. The darkness that had threatened to consume everything was gone, leaving behind a world that, despite its calm, felt hollow. Emily stood alone in the field, her breath ragged, her hands still trembling from the battle she had just waged within herself. She had thought the rift had been vanquished for good, but as she stood there, staring at the remnants of what had once been a living, breathing threat, she realized that it would never fully be gone. It would linger in the corners of her mind, in the whispers of forgotten memories, and in the shadows where it could always return. But she had won. For now, she took one step forward, then another, as if the ground itself was testing her resolve. The weight of everything she had been through threatened to crush her, but she refused to stop. There was still something left to do. Somewhere, someone was waiting. Her thoughts drifted to Ethan. She closed her eyes, feeling the tear in her heart widen. He was gone, truly gone. She had tried to save him, to pull him back from the abyss, but the rift had taken him in a way she could never fully understand. She hadn't been able to save him. The devastation of that loss was still raw, and yet, deep inside, there was a flicker of understanding. Ethan's sacrifice had been her own salvation. But Emily couldn't stay in this field forever, trapped in grief. She had to move forward. She had to find a way to live in this new world. The soft wind began to pick up, ruffling her hair, and Emily turned, feeling the pull of something distant, something calling to her. The world was peaceful, but deep down, she knew this peace wasn't permanent. Not while the rift's influence still lingered within her. It took Emily a few days to return to the abandoned town where it all began. The streets were eerily quiet, as if time had forgotten about the place. She hadn't come back to find answers. There were no answers to be found here. She had come because the call, the tug in her chest, had led her back to this broken, forgotten place. The remains of the town were still scattered around her, houses with their windows shattered. The remnants of what had once been a thriving community, now overtaken by vines and nature. The echoes of the past haunted every corner, and for a moment, Emily found herself standing still, letting the silence wash over her. She hadn't known what to expect when she returned, but standing here, in the place where Ethan and she had uncovered the rift's dark secrets, she couldn't shake the sense that the work wasn't over. It was as if a piece of the puzzle was missing, and she had returned to this place for one final revelation. There was a pull, a soft tug in the back of her mind, that led her toward a building in the center of town. The old library. It was in ruins, its once proud structure crumbled and broken. Yet it stood, defying time and decay, as though it too had a secret it wanted to share. She walked up the stone steps, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The door creaked open, its hinges rusted and stiff. Emily stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust, the shelves empty except for the few forgotten tomes scattered across the floor. But one shelf caught her eye. A solitary old book, bound in cracked leather, was still sitting there, untouched by the decay of time. Her heart raced as she approached it, the pull growing stronger with each step. The book had no title on its spine, and the leather felt strangely warm beneath her fingers. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was clear. The book was filled with notes from the researchers who had first uncovered the rift and its origins. As Emily turned the pages, she realized something shocking. The rift was never meant to be destroyed. It had been an integral part of the world, a necessary force, and it was clear from the writings that whoever had originally sealed it had done so with a terrible price. The researchers had written that the rift could never be fully closed. The balance it had created had to be maintained. To remove it entirely would destroy everything. The forces it controlled, creation and destruction, had to coexist but in careful balance. By destroying the rift, Emily had disrupted that balance. The world would continue to exist, but it would be unstable. The realization hit her like a cold wave. "No," she whispered aloud. "What have I done?" She turned frantically through the pages, desperate for a solution, for a way to restore balance. And then, in the final pages, she found a chilling detail, something the researchers had hinted at, but had never fully explored. The rift wasn't just a force. It was a sentience, something that could influence the will of the living. Something that, if broken, would leave behind an irreversible scar on the world. Her hands shook as she read the final note. The rift will return. It will seek to right the imbalance. It will choose its new vessel, its new host. She let the book fall from her hands as the realization struck her. The rift wasn't gone. It had simply found a new way to survive, and it had chosen her. The truth was undeniable now. The rift had never been a force that could be destroyed. It was a force that could be contained, balanced. But Emily, in her grief, had broken that balance. By attempting to destroy it completely, she had invited its return, its dark rebirth. She had become the new vessel. As the days passed, Emily began to notice strange things happening. At night, The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, and sometimes they whispered. The darkness was pulling at her. The same cold sensation she had felt when she had first encountered the rift was now crawling beneath her skin. It was subtle at first, like an itch she couldn't reach, but soon it grew. Her thoughts became clouded, her dreams filled with visions of the rift's pulse, its whisper, its call. She saw Ethan's face again, his eyes dark, hollow, twisted by the same force she had tried to destroy. The nightmares grew worse, and the shadows in her mind began to speak to her, telling her that the end was near. The world was crumbling, and she was the one to blame. It was too much. And then, one night, as she lay awake, trying to fight the overwhelming pull of the rift, she felt it, something cold, something ancient, deep within her chest, as though the rift had taken root in her heart. The shadows were alive inside her now. She had not just destroyed the rift. She had absorbed it, and it was growing inside her, seeking its own return, its own dominance over the world. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it consume her. The battle for her soul had begun. Emily stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The person who looked back at her was familiar, yet entirely different. Her features were unchanged, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something dark, that made her question if the woman in the glass was truly her anymore. The rift was inside her, twisting and pulling at her soul, feeding on her emotions, amplifying her grief, her fear, her guilt. It was relentless. The more she resisted, the more it pressed back, like a living force that wouldn't let go. The whispers in her mind had become louder now. They were always there, echoing, insistent. Sometimes, she could almost make out words, promises of power, of freedom, of escape from the torment of her decisions. Other times, it was just a hum, a constant presence that gnawed at her sanity. It had been weeks since the return of the rift, and still, she could feel it pushing at her, wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils of smoke. She had tried to fight it, tried to hold on to what was left of herself, but the battle was growing harder. Every night, the nightmares came, images of the rift, of Ethan's face distorted by darkness, of herself, consumed by the very thing she had tried to destroy. Her body trembled with the weight of it, the pressure of the rift's pull tightening with each passing day. She couldn't escape it. No matter where she went, it followed, feeding off her emotions, growing stronger. It had taken root in her heart, in her very soul, and now it was all she could feel. But there was still a flicker of defiance within her. She couldn't just let it win. Not like this. Emily's fingers trembled as she reached for the pendant she had worn since the beginning of this journey. It had once been a reminder of the life she had before everything fell apart, a symbol of hope, of who she used to be. Now, it felt like a weight, a relic from a life that seemed so distant. She closed her fingers around it, drawing a deep breath. If the rift wanted to consume her, she would make sure it had to fight for it. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. Days blurred together. Emily could no longer tell where one day ended and another began. The rift had started to invade her waking hours, filling her every thought. She tried to hold on to her old self, to the memories of her life before all of this had started, but they felt distant, fading as the rift dug deeper into her soul. The world outside seemed to move on, indifferent to the war raging inside her. But it wasn't just the darkness inside her that tormented her. There were things happening in the world that she couldn't ignore. Strange occurrences were becoming more frequent, flickers of shadow, whispers on the wind, things that felt wrong, out of place. It was as though the rift was reaching out, spreading its influence, slowly tearing apart the seams of reality. One night, while walking through the town, Emily noticed a figure in the distance. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its form shifting and bending in unnatural ways. She froze, her heart racing. This wasn't just a rift. This was something else, something far worse. The figure moved toward her, its form growing clearer with each step. Its face was obscured by a mask, but its eyes, they were the same hollow, black voids that she had seen in Ethan's face before the end. "Do you feel it?" The figure's voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from deep within the earth. The rift is calling Emily. It is stronger now, stronger than ever. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer immediately, instead tilting its head, studying her. "I am what remains, what you tried to erase." Its voice was chilling, filled with ancient knowledge, as though it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. "You cannot escape what you've awakened." Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. "What are you talking about?" I stopped the rift. I destroyed it." "No," the figure said, stepping closer, its presence overwhelming. "You only released it. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot be stopped. The rift is a part of you now, and it will always be." Emily could feel the words sinking into her like poison, the weight of their truth pressing down on her chest. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. The figure reached out a long, bony hand, and Emily's body froze, her mind resisting the urge to give in. "You can fight it," the figure whispered, "but you'll never win. You are the vessel now. You will never be free." The darkness within her responded, a cold pulse that seemed to synchronize with the figure's presence. The rift stirred, a restless force seeking to claim her completely. Emily could feel it clawing at her insides, pushing her toward the abyss, urging her to give in. But something inside her fought back. A memory, a voice. Ethan. He had tried to fight. He had tried to hold on. But in the end, the rift had consumed him. But Emily wasn't him. She couldn't let herself fall to the same fate. She wouldn't allow the rift to take her. She couldn't. With a cry of defiance, she focused on the pendant around her neck, the faintest spark of her old self flaring to life. The pendant had once been her tether to the world she knew, to the person she had been before the darkness had taken hold. She reached out with everything she had left, pulling the last bit of light inside her to the surface. And then she fought. The rift inside her recoiled, shuddering as Emily summoned all her strength to push it back. She could feel the weight of its power, the overwhelming force that sought to drown her, but she refused to yield. With every breath, she pushed harder, reaching deep into her core and fighting back against the consuming darkness. The figure watched her with cold, detached eyes, but Emily didn't care. She focused on the pendant, on the memory of Ethan, on everything that had once been hers. She wasn't going to let it go. She wasn't going to let the rift win. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and a low hum filled the air. The rift was screaming, thrashing inside her, but Emily didn't falter. She continued to push, focusing her will, letting the light within her burn through the dark. The figure stepped back, its form flickering as the rift's grip on Emily weakened. "You cannot do this. You cannot fight what you are." Emily's eyes blazed with determination. "I will not become you." In that moment, the energy inside her burst forth. The rift's power shattered, sending a shockwave through the air. The figure let out a scream that echoed across the empty streets, its form dissolving into darkness as the rift's hold on Emily broke. The world around her shifted. The dark shadows receded, the whispers fading into nothingness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily stood still, her body exhausted, but free from the rift's influence. But even as the darkness lifted, Emily knew the battle wasn't truly over. The rift was still a part of her, and it always would be. But now, she understood it. She could feel its presence, but it no longer controlled her. She had won the first battle, but there was more to come. The rift would not stop. It would always seek to return, and Emily would be ready. The wind blew softly through the broken streets as Emily stood alone, her hands shaking with the remnants of the battle. The darkness that had once consumed her was gone, at least for now. The echoes of the rift had receded, its whisper replaced by the eerie stillness of the town. But even as she stood there, the peace felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. She felt different now, changed though she couldn't quite place how. The rift's presence was still there, lurking beneath her skin, but it was no longer the dominating force it had been. She could feel it, restless, like a caged animal. But she had learned something in the battle. She was still in control. But that control came at a cost. Every part of her had been stretched to its breaking point. The battle had drained her, both physically and emotionally. She had lost Ethan, the one person who had meant everything to her, and now she was left with nothing but this cursed connection to the rift. It was a bond she didn't ask for, one she didn't want, but it was one she could no longer deny. The world around her was still, too still, as if it were waiting, holding its breath. She turned toward the horizon, where the sky stretched out in muted colors of twilight. She had no idea what came next. The rift hadn't just broken, it had adapted, had fused with her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Would it ever let her go? Would she ever be free of its influence? The questions lingered in her mind, unanswered as she began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The sense of unease that had settled into her chest grew heavier with each step, but there was no turning back now. As she walked through the empty streets, the memories began to resurface. Her mind flashed to the days before all of this had started, before the rift, before Ethan's sacrifice. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of herself she had lost along the way. A version that had been naive enough to believe that things could stay simple, that the world was safe. She paused at the edge of the town, staring out into the vast wilderness beyond. The trees swayed in the wind, the air crisp with the scent of pine. It was beautiful here in a way that felt unnatural. It was the calm before the storm, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something waiting, something that had been disturbed by her actions. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible at first, like the rustle of wind through dry leaves. Her heart skipped a beat as the air grew colder. Emily. The voice was low, familiar. Her stomach tightened as she turned around, searching for the source of the sound. There was no one there, just the same empty streets, the same broken town. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if the air itself had shaped the words. Emily, come closer. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She didn't want to follow the voice, but something deep inside urged her forward, pulling her closer to the sound. It was as if the rift had awakened again, calling to her, trying to lure her back into its embrace. But this wasn't the rift. No, this voice, it was something else. The air shifted, a heavy presence moving behind her. Emily turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and shrouded in darkness, his features obscured by a cloak. His eyes, those same hollow, dark eyes, stared back at her. Ethan? Emily's voice trembled, the name falling from her lips before she could stop it. The figure didn't answer, but its presence was undeniable. It was him, or at least it looked like him. The figure stepped forward, the shadows seeming to pulse around him as if they were alive. Ethan, what are you? She whispered, stepping back, her mind racing. The figure's mouth twitched into something that almost resembled a smile, though it was chilling in its emptiness. I'm the part of him you've been searching for, the voice replied, but it wasn't quite Ethan's voice anymore. It was warped, twisted by something darker. What happened to you? She asked, her heart breaking all over again. I thought you were gone. I never truly left, the figure interrupted, its voice carrying a weight of something ancient, something far more sinister than the man she had once known. You've opened the door, Emily. You've brought it all back. Emily's stomach churned as realization set in. This wasn't Ethan. This was something that had taken him, something that had come through the rift. I didn't mean to. Her voice broke, and she felt tears sting her eyes, but she fought them back. I didn't mean for any of this. The figure's smile widened, its form flickering like a shadow in the dark. It's too late for that. The rift needs to be fed, Emily. It needs you. And now, it has me. The shadows around the figure surged, twisting and writhing like living things, reaching out toward Emily. She recoiled, the rift within her stirring in response, feeding on the fear, feeding on the darkness that had now entered the world. No! Emily whispered, backing away, her heart racing. No, this can't be happening. The figure took another step forward, its presence suffocating, filling the air with an oppressive heaviness. It's already begun. You can't undo what you've done. The rift is awakening, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Emily's mind spun as the figure loomed over her, its dark presence suffocating, pushing her toward the edge of madness. She had been so sure, so certain that the rift was gone, that she had defeated it once and for all. But the figure, the twisted reflection of Ethan, was the proof that the rift wasn't truly gone. It had just changed. She could feel it now, the rift stirring within her, reaching out in response to the figure's call. It was like a living thing, a parasite, clawing at her insides, seeking a way to break free once more. "No," she whispered fiercely, clutching the pendant tightly in her hand. "I won't let you win. I won't let it take me." But the figure only laughed, a hollow sound that reverberated through the air. "It's already begun, Emily. You can't stop it. Not now." Emily's grip on the pendant tightened. She could feel the weight of the rift's power inside her, pulsing, twisting. It wanted to break free, to consume her, but she was stronger than that. She had to be. She looked at the figure, her heart heavy with the pain of losing Ethan, but she couldn't let that grief destroy her. She couldn't let the rift win again. There was only one way forward, one way to stop this cycle from repeating, to stop the rift from taking more than it already had. She had to sever the connection, once and for all. Taking a deep breath, Emily raised the pendant high, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I will fight you," she said, her words filled with resolve. "And I will win." Emily's breath was shallow, her heart thundering in her chest as she faced the twisted reflection of Ethan before her. The figure in front of her, a grotesque manifestation of the rift's power, stood like a nightmare come to life, a cruel distortion of the person she once knew. The air around them crackled, thick with the tension of what was to come. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to flee from the dark, suffocating presence that threatened to engulf her. But she couldn't. Not anymore. She couldn't let the rift win. The figure before her, Ethan's hollow shell, stepped forward, the shadows swirling around him like a cloak. It spoke again, the voice not entirely Ethan's, but something deeper, something more ancient, filled with malice. "You've always known, Emily," the figure said, its voice thick with disdain. "You can never outrun this. The rift isn't just a thing. It's a part of you. Always has been. Always will be." "No," Emily replied, her voice trembling with a resolve that she hadn't known she still possessed. "You're wrong. I am not you. I will never be you." The figure's laughter was dark and cruel. "You think you can just sever the bond? That you can rid yourself of the rift and live as if nothing happened? You can't, Emily. It's in your blood. You can't escape it." His words were poison, dripping into her mind, trying to erode the walls she had built. The rift's influence had always been powerful, insidious, creeping into her thoughts and twisting her sense of reality. But now, standing in the face of this darkness, Emily realized something that she hadn't before. The rift wasn't just a force of destruction. It was a part of her, yes, but it was also a reflection of her own brokenness. Her fears, her doubts, her grief. It fed on those things. But she wasn't the same person anymore. She had faced the abyss, and she had learned to live with the shadows without letting them consume her. "You're wrong," she repeated, her voice steady now, even as the rift inside her twisted and clawed for control. "I am stronger than this." Without warning, she raised the pendant high, the light from it flickering in the growing darkness. The rift inside her stirred, answering the call, but she held it back. She wouldn't let it control her. Not this time. The figure before her recoiled, its form flickering and shifting. It was no longer just a reflection of Ethan. It was something far darker, more primal, something born from the rift itself. And it was angry. "You think you can fight me?" The figure spat, its voice now a distorted shriek. "You think you can control me? You can't. You'll never be free. The rift will consume you, Emily. It always does." "Maybe it does," Emily said, taking a step forward, her eyes locked on the figure. "But it won't be today." The air crackled as energy surged through her, the pendant pulsing with an unnatural glow. The rift inside her fought to break free, But Emily kept it in check, focused on the strength she had found within herself. She didn't need to defeat the rift. She needed to control it, to make it her own. And for that, she needed to stop running from it. The figure lunged toward her, its form dissolving into a mass of swirling shadows. Emily's heart raced as the darkness closed in around her, but she stood her ground, raising her arms to channel the energy that was coursing through her veins. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The rift's power surged, roaring in her ears like a storm, but Emily focused. She could feel it now, not just as an external force, but as something inside her, part of who she had become. The darkness and the light were one. The rift was a part of her, and she was done running from it. With a cry, she released the energy, pouring everything she had into the pendant. A blinding light erupted from it, filling the air, casting the darkness away. The figure screamed, its form writhing as the light tore through it. "No!" the figure howled, its voice distorted and inhuman. "You can't," but it was too late. The rift's influence shattered, its hold on the figure disintegrating under the force of Emily's will. The shadows around them dissipated, the air clearing, and Emily collapsed to her knees, breathless, as the weight of the battle lifted from her shoulders. The figure, Ethan's twisted reflection, dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the echo of its haunting laughter behind. Emily trembled as she looked around, the world now eerily still. The rift's influence had been broken, at least for now, but she knew it wasn't truly over. She had learned the truth about the rift. It wasn't just a force to be battled and destroyed. It was a part of the world, a part of her, and it would always be there waiting. But this time, Emily was ready. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air felt clearer now, lighter, as if the world itself was breathing again. Emily stood on the edge of the town, her heart still racing from the confrontation, but a sense of calm was settling over her. She wasn't sure what came next. The rift wasn't gone. She knew that now. It wasn't something that could be erased or destroyed, but it was something she could control. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't afraid of it. The pendant around her neck was warm in her hand, the faintest flicker of light still pulsing from it. She gazed at it for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to Ethan. She had lost him, had lost so much along the way, but she had survived. She was still here, and that meant there was still hope. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be challenges. The rift might return in some other form, and there would be times when the darkness would threaten to overwhelm her. But Emily had learned that she could face it. She could stand against it, no matter how many times it tried to drag her down. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The memories of Ethan, the lessons he had taught her, would guide her. And though the rift was still a part of her, it would no longer control her. She would walk her own path. And for the first time, that path felt like it was hers to choose. With a final glance at the town, Emily turned and walked away, toward whatever came next. And the rift? It was there, deep inside her, but it wasn't in control anymore. She was